Well, good morning and welcome to the third meeting of the FCC's Open Internet Advisory Committee. We've had two really good meetings, first in DC, then in Boston. Now we travel to Silicon Valley, and we're really starting to dig into stuff now, so there's a lot of substance on the agenda for today. I thought it would be great to start by first noting that we are being webcast, so anything said here is not being confined to this room, and in fact will be part of the public record. And to go down the line with our usual battery of introductions so that members of the committee can introduce themselves, say a little bit about...
Greetings, this is Dennis Roberson.
That sounded like someone speaking. Dennis, you're going first, is that right? Houston, do we have you? All right, well, we do have people coming in by webcast as well. So after we go down the physical room, I'll indicate maybe that people coming from the ceiling can introduce themselves as well. But Chuck, why don't we begin with you?
Vice President of Research at AT&T Labs.
I'm Kevin McInerney, Senior Vice President of Network Engineering, Comcast.
Housley, founder of Vigil Security.
Jen Rexford, Professor of Computer Science at Princeton University.
Brad Burnham, partner at Union Square Ventures.
Michelle Zatlin, co-founder of Cloudflare.
Cooper, I'm the Chief Computer Scientist at the Center for Democracy and Technology.
I'm Marcus Weldon, I'm the CTO for Alcatel-Lucent.
David Clark from MIT.
Jonathan Citrin, I teach at Harvard.
Tejas Narachenya, Special Counsel at the FCC.
Shane Greenstein, I'm a professor at Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University.
Matt Murphy with the Disney and ESPN Media Networks.
Chip Sharp in Tech Policy and Internet Governance at Cisco Systems.
Harvey Anderson, General Counsel, Mozilla.
Neil Hunt at Netflix.
Matt Larson, CEO of VistaBeam.
Okay, that's everybody in the room. Those on the phone, feel free to introduce yourselves. Dennis, are you there?
Jonathan Levy with the FCC.
Wow.
Yeah, this is Dennis Roberson. I'm here. I'm not able to hear you guys on the other end. That was the question.
We incorporate by reference the irony of the Open Internet Advisory Committee of the FCC not having a proper phone bridge. And I trust we can try to get that working. I'm looking balefully at Kendra, who is the person who makes everything work. She's taking care of it, she says. In the meantime, are there others on the line who can hear us?
This is Jessica Gonzalez from National Hispanic Media Coalition.
Welcome, Jessica. Anyone else on the phone coming in?
We can hear you great on the webcast. We just can't hear you on the phone.
I see. That might be literally good enough for government work. Which reminds me, we should welcome Tejas formally. He is taking the place of Dan Kirchner, who I believe is now working at Blizzard Software, from one game to another, as it were. And Tejas is now our federal designated liaison officer for the work of the committee. Thank you, Tejas, for coming out.
Thank you very much.
And a welcome to Matt Murphy, who has just joined the committee as well for the first time in person. Okay, well, that being the case, why don't we move immediately to our first substantive agenda item, which is hearing about the work of the Mobile Working Group, chaired by Jennifer Rexford, which has produced a report which, for those in the audience, there are copies available if you'd like to see it, and copies distributed throughout the committee. Jen, do you want to say a few words?
Definitely. So I'll just give a quick overview of the report. And before doing that, just to give a little bit of context, when our group started, we thought it would be useful to have a small number of case studies to look at, to be able to start grappling with issues around the tensions between carriers, device and OS manufacturers, and application developers. And so at the time the group was started, these issues between AT&T and FaceTime, Apple's FaceTime application, were in the news quite a bit. And so we picked that as an initial case study. And so this report represents the output of a number of months of conversations the group has been having about that. And our goal wasn't so much to render a concrete conclusion, but to flesh out the space of what happened, what was sort of the facts on the ground, what were the issues that were affecting how different groups were thinking about what happened here, and then finally a handful of opinions at the end that summarize different viewpoints on the way forward. So just to summarize for people that are not familiar, what happened is that Apple has an application called FaceTime that's available on the Mac and the iPhone and the iPad, and was originally available only over Wi-Fi. And then in the summer, they announced that it would be available to run over 3G and other cellular networks. And then AT&T made an announcement that they would be not allowing users to use FaceTime over the cellular network. And then there's a lot of back and forth after that about whether this was appropriate or not. And a number of groups came forward saying that this was a violation of the Open Internet Order. AT&T had some responses about how it was not a violation because they were being very transparent about what they were doing, and that this was being done because of reasonable network management practice, and that they don't have a competing application to FaceTime, so there's no sort of competitiveness issues in play. So that's sort of roughly the facts on the ground. And more recently, AT&T has announced that a number of the tiered pricing plans allow their users now to use FaceTime. So over time, as we were working on the report, the facts on the ground kind of shifted underneath us as more and more progress was made towards meeting in the middle. So the report talks about a few main issues that sort of drive people's thinking about how FaceTime should or should not have been handled on the network. One is that FaceTime, unlike many apps, is a preloaded application that's integrated with the normal calling features on the phone. That makes it immediately available to anyone who has an appropriate version of iOS on their phone, as opposed to something that requires explicit downloading. Even a free app like Skype is really only available on around 10% of people's phones because it requires explicit downloading to be made available. So that raised concerns that it might receive rapid use in a way that a non-preloaded application might not. The second issue was that it's a very high bandwidth application because it's a two-way video calling. It puts quite a bit of strain, particularly on the uplink from the phone to the rest of the internet. And experiments seem to show that FaceTime is not as friendly in the face of network congestion as a number of other multimedia applications. And so heavy use of the application could easily cause a lot of congestion on the uplink from the phone to the cell tower, which would compete with other users running up. Issue kind of closely related to the first two was a need for new applications to sometimes go under a phased deployment to be able to gauge what impact they might have on the underlying network before they're used in a wide scale. And that raised interesting questions about the best way to sub-select a user community to do an initial deployment of an app. One possible way of doing that being the using of pricing plans as a way to sub-select a set of users that might use an app and to avoid having users with unlimited data exhausted. The fourth issue we talked about was whether plans on the phone rather than by the carrier inside the network. And so there's some debate about how one should think about what. So those are sort of the four issues we talked about. And then in the end, we came to three sort of summary opinions. So everything I've said so far, we sort of uniformly put the facts on the ground, what happened and what the trade-offs are in supporting an application like FaceTime over a resource-constrained network. And then there's sort of jumping off points where different people could reasonably come to different conclusions about what to do based on these facts on the ground and based on these issues. And so I would say our came to a consensus of different opinions that are from the point of view of carriers and from the point of view of network equipment place on application-agnostic network management, on the technologies available today, and so on. And so I'll probably leave it at that and maybe open it to questions. Jonathan?
Questions from people or comments from members of the working? Blown away if there aren't any. I saw there was some late-breaking news, and I don't know if it should be in quotes or not, today, about an announcement from AT&T. I guess a further loosening of the restrictions on the use of FaceTime. Now it can be used 3G, et cetera.
Right.
But those with grandparented unlimited usage plans, am I right in saying may still not use?
That's my understanding. Is that?
That's my understanding.
Yeah, that's my understanding too.
Yes.
I don't know if that, is there anything in that move that materially affects any of the analysis of?
I think, I'd be curious your thoughts on that, but I think it's a sort of incremental widening, and it was sort of consistent with announcements AT&T made a month or so ago of planning to expand the set of plans under which the application was available. So I don't think it appreciably changed the discussion.
So I agree. We talked about this briefly this morning. I think our marketing organization and engineering teams in the public statements said from the very beginning that our concern really was the potential of this application to cause a significant focused overload in our network. Those who were involved in the discussion will, know that the FaceTime application can consume really about a third of the uplink bandwidth in a UMTS channel. So it's a fairly significant load on the network. And so the statements that were made early on was that we would monitor the usage and evaluate the risk and loosen the restrictions over time, and that's exactly what's happened. So I don't really think it materially changes the analysis.
Some sense that possibly even that restriction could evaporate?
Say again?
Some chance that even that restriction that remains, that those have unlimited plans can't use it, that could evaporate?
I can't speculate about what decision will be made there. Certainly the points that we made in the report were that the tiered plans have an inherent effect of encouraging users to manage their usage or control their usage. And for very bandwidth intensive plans or applications, unlimited plans don't have that effect. So other carriers have essentially eliminated the unlimited plans, which has roughly the same effect on consumers as in terms of their ability to use FaceTime, because it forces those users to a shared plan. What AT&T has chosen to do is to continue to allow users that had unlimited plans to use those unlimited plans with this one restriction that I'm aware of. So, in fact, I believe we have attempted to provide greater choice to consumers in the way that we structure our pricing plans, and also, as all of the carriers are doing, trying to encourage a shift towards tiered or shared plans as a way of better encouraging consumers to manage their use of the network.
Any other questions or comments from the committee?
No, I'll comment, Jonathan. I think what was interesting, independent of the specifics of FaceTime, and I think what we're going to find overall is we had we started with people with different views in this working group. And I think by having an intelligent discussion of the issues, we all realized we all saw the merit of the other's arguments. In fact, if you read the three opinions, there's a substantial overlap between the three opinions. Some would say it should have happened a different way now. Some would say those mechanisms are not available and this was the best way to handle it. And some would say it could be handled differently in future. But fundamentally, I think there was a substantial agreement that this was a complicated issue and it was constrained by the facilities available to the operator and the uncertainty. And then the debate was really, should we have done more in advance to manage this, or should we do something different in future? But it wasn't that there was a black and white issue of good versus bad. It really was a nuanced issue where there were three different views of could more have been done in advance, or should we do something different in the future? And I think that's, if others on the committee or the working group see it differently, but it was a very interesting thing, and I think we're going to see a lot of that as we go forward on the other topics.
Huh?
Is that fair?
Totally.
David, and I should remind people to speak into the mic for the webcast.
I think, especially this microphone, we've been told we really have to shout into it. As somebody was watching this process but wasn't on that subgroup, I think one of the themes that came out, which has come out in some other contexts, and I think it could be a theme for us going forward, is the question of what is the role and what are the expectations we have for application designers. In the internet, traditionally in the internet, we've basically said, well, application designers can do anything they want, and we don't have much control over it, so we don't impose any expectations on them. In a usage-constrained space like the wireless space, where it's clear that there just isn't infinite capacity or enough capacity that you can sort of use it casually, I think there's a question of should we be giving advice to application designers as to how to design their application so that it's somewhat disciplined? Should we be giving users feedback as to which applications are more likely to blow out their usage caps if they had usage caps? I think that in the context where a lot of people like unlimited plans, it's clear you're going to have some feedback somewhere, or that's going to become untenable. Now, I think most people, when you contemplate one or another style of feedback, say, I don't like that. I think almost every form of feedback you come up with, some people don't like. But I'm worried about the resulting instability, which could lead to the erosion of the unlimited plans. And in many cases, unlimited is going to end up being in quotes. And the question is, what's the best way to do that that's consumer-friendly, and I would say innovation-friendly in the sense that you can tell an application designer, look, if you do this, and these are reasonable constraints, then you won't mess up the larger ecosystem. But I think that the application designers haven't necessarily had a seat at the table, and we haven't really engaged them with what you might call design patterns. They say, well, why don't you do it like this? And I think that's a broader issue. It's not just an issue for this working group. I think it's a broader issue for the community as we try to figure out how to keep this ecosystem healthy.
And David, when you say we, do you mean, well, who do you mean? Who would the we be here?
Did I accidentally say an unqualified we there?
About 10 times.
Okay. Well, I think this committee has certain scope to recommend something in that case, but I think it's probably a larger we that I was thinking about.
Yes.
It is the research community, it is the community that's trying to understand this ecosystem in the large. So there's probably many values of we. It's not just this committee.
Yes, that there could come to be ideally maybe some practices around telegraphing application usage and limits and to users what works and what doesn't, something like that.
I mean, we're seeing this in other contexts. We're seeing applications that on mobile devices that chatter in the background and run your battery down, and all kinds of things that application designers could do to make their, and by the way, some of those get hosed, right? You see criticisms of applications on websites that say, don't download this because it's a battery killer or it's a this or a that. And I think one of the issues in this case, of course, if I understand it, was that this came bundled on the machine. It wasn't something you had a choice of downloading and you could see how many stars it got. You sort of had it there, and so you were tempted to use it. Now, what that actually makes a difference, I don't know. But, having just had a bad mobile device experience, it's clear that the apps that come bundled on the app sometimes get badly hosed on the blogs as well. But
So you two are touching on something. I mean, Jen should comment in, and Chuck, we've actually started looking at the work that AT&T had done on a tool called the Application Resource Optimizer, which is actually intended to look at your application for you as an app developer and say, here's how you're using the network inefficiently, you're doing too much pre-caching. Apparently on mobile devices, if you scroll over a web page multiple times, it actually re-downloads the content. So, exactly, that's so what you would rather do is cache it once and say, I've got a copy of that, so I don't need to reload that. There are many things like that, as well as use of battery and signaling resources. And there are efforts underway that we've been discussing in the group of should we do more to recommend that sort of behavior, and how would you let the user know if an application wasn't doing this? It's all very well for the carrier to say to the application developer, but should the user have an alert saying this particular application you're using is actually a bit of a hog, and that's why you're dissatisfied currently with your battery? Jen and Chuck and everything.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the important point in what Marcus is saying is that we're looking for win-wins. That if an application is more judicious in how it uses the network, the application will be able to be more widely used. Users will be more happy about both their bandwidth usage and their battery, and carriers will be happy that their bandwidth and signaling resources aren't being wasted. So it does seem like there are at least some places where incentives are aligned. And if we can find a way to push for those incentive alignments to really pop out so we have win-wins, that would be really great. And that's what we're hoping to explore next in the working group. Is mechanisms for doing that.
So that may well be the next agenda item up, to look at stuff like that. Other comments or thoughts? David, you just raised at the very end the question of how much the fact that FaceTime was bundled with the phone matters. I know that came up a lot in the working group, and it certainly does, at least colloquially, appear to give whoever's handing you the phone more license to say how it's used, since it's kind of part of the functionality of the phone, even though it looks like and sort of is an app as well. And I guess it leaves for another day the question of how some of the principles would apply if it weren't bundled with the phone, but some other app that were singled out because it was said to have very poor network function or characteristics, and those limits were applied. I imagine there'd be very different reaction if a carrier's unlimited grandparented plan were to say, well, no more YouTube. You know, if you want YouTube, you have to move to a tiered plan. That would just be a very different, probably at least differently perceived situation. And it's exactly what we don't have before us right now. So, yep.
I think one thing that came up in this discussion, it kind of highlighted the importance of having unlicensed spectrum available for doing Wi-Fi offload to make applications like this really work well. The FaceTime application specifically is one of several that consumes a lot of bandwidth on mobile network and really pushes the limits of what it can do. And it's just another illustration of something where you're trying to make a network do something that maybe isn't necessarily intended to do on an extremely large scale, and illustrates the importance of probably having Wi-Fi offload and a lot more small cell deployment to deliver to the users what they're expecting.
Yeah.
To your point, Jonathan, I think what really crystallized for me during the working group discussions was all of the situation-specific facts coming together. So, you know, not only the application being native to the phone so that, you know, all those millions of users will have it there in the calling interface right away, but also the heavy uplink usage, the not terribly adaptive codec for the purpose of, you know, creating a nice high-quality call. All of those things together, I think, were extremely important in catalyzing the carrier's reaction to how are we going to handle this. And so I think, you know, to me there was a bit of a lesson there in that, you know, every single one of these is not going to be the same because, and even, you know, the example of YouTube, like it might not just be that YouTube isn't bundled with a particular device, but also that the majority of the traffic is in the downlink and not the uplink, right? So there's lots of different factors that can go into, you know, creating a potential pain point for a carrier. And I think, you know, from my perspective, it's still a matter of saying, can you develop an agnostic or a neutral solution that can endure all of those, you know, across different situations, but that the combination of the situation-specific facts is really what kind of brings these things to the fore.
That's a good reason, I guess. It's at least a virtue to doing the case study approach, so you really can't avoid but get into the facts of it. Brad?
So we came back a number of times to this, the model of battery life, because that's something that is immediately obvious to consumers, and there's actually a number of applications that have been developed and are available for various devices to help consumers understand more about what's going on with battery life. But where that analogy kind of breaks down is there is no unlimited battery that I know of, and there are a number of unlimited plans, and so we end up kind of thinking about the trade-off between the consumer value in unlimited plans, and you can make the argument that a lot of applications benefit from the existence of these unlimited plans because consumers don't think about whether or not they're bandwidth hogs or not. They use them. So you can make the argument that unlimited plans are good for innovation. But to the degree that with an unlimited plan, the way you solve congestion is by discriminating against specific applications, that turns out to be very bad for innovation because it makes it difficult for people to invest time and investors to invest money because they're unsure of whether or not that application will actually be able to get to market. And so one of the difficult trade-offs that we have here is the trade-off between the consumer's interest in having an unlimited plan and the benefits to innovation that that might yield, and the application developer's interest in having a non-discriminatory environment where they can be certain that their application will get to market and a carrier will not choose to, in some way block it or throttle it or price it in a way that makes it less attractive to consumers.
And I guess we should point out that that's one of the 3 summary opinions represented in the report, precisely because at some point, as you say, it's a trade-off and it's hard to make everything utterly commensurable. Any other thoughts or questions on this? Yep, Jen?
Just playing off of the point Alyssa made about the details mattering here, another factor that Chuck alluded to as well is that we have an interesting environment where carriers differ dramatically in what mix of pricing plans they offer, some having a lot of grandfathered unlimited plans and others not. And also how many of the subscribers on a particular carrier's network are users of the iPhone or the iPad as opposed to a range of devices. And so that ended up factoring into our discussions a lot here because the way this particular application going viral might affect different carriers actually varied quite a bit because of the mix of subscriber plans and the mix of the number of devices each carrier might have.
So I think we can all agree it's very complicated, and there's varying degrees of conclusion that you come out of this. What I can't reconcile yet is how does this assess whether the open internet order is working for mobile? How do you make that connection back? And so I would love to hear the working group's comments on that, about how you're thinking about that, because it starts by saying, we're trying to assess how well the internet open order is working, and I think going through the case study was a very good exercise. I'm just curious how you're linking it back.
Take a stab at that, but others could as well. So we sort of intentionally didn't talk about that in great detail, partially because we didn't want one single case study with its myriad details to really drive an interpretation of the order. So we sort of intentionally chose not to do that. The second reason we chose not to do that is that I think some of the provisions in the order are inherently high level, and for example, transparency, non-blocking of competing applications, and reasonable network management practice are all 3 major provisions, and they're actually quite hard to interpret in this case. I mean, one could easily quibble about whether what happened here was reasonable network management practice, and certainly one would quibble about, as technology changes, the set of reasonable network management practices might reasonably change over time, so it makes it really hard to make a strict judgment of whether this falls under it now or would in the future. And so I think we decided to kind of sidestep those issues in part because they just seemed untenable and difficult to reconcile with the concrete details of one case study.
But let me try a high-level comment. I think you were saying that you want to remove the ambiguity for an application developer as to whether there's risk in bringing developing a product, as to whether you can bring it to market. And there's another dimension of transparency that you could imagine here, which is for different carriers to basically try to make clear the circumstances under which an application would raise concerns for them, so that you know what that is. So, and again, that would have to change over time. Okay, several years ago, it would have been ridiculous to watch movies on your iPhone. People do it now. So this has to be a rolling target. But part of the risk to an innovator, it seems to me, is the uncertainty. And the question is, could the uncertainty have been mitigated here? It doesn't directly apply because this was bundled in, but if you thought about it from the context of a third-party developer, can you imagine a way of explaining that a carrier could choose to explain what they're doing such that an application designer would understand when he's in safe harbor and when he's getting up near the edge, and clarifying that might mitigate some of the anxieties of the developers. It's clear there's some things you just can't do on an iPhone, right? You're not going to project holographic images. I mean, there's some things you're just not going to do today.
Right. I think there's, what we're talking about here is a market architecture, and if the market architecture is built around the principle of transparency, I can imagine that you could provide enough detail so that a developer could, could build that. The challenge with that is I think it creates a pretty significant regulatory overhead, because then you have to be able to police those details and follow up and figure out whether or not there is some other form of discrimination going on that isn't being revealed. Whereas if you used a model, a market architecture, which was based more on non-discrimination, period, but you manage things like congestion through a price signal, then you can allow the market to develop a little bit more organically with less regulatory oversight. And so it's a choice we could make, but I think we need to understand those trade-offs.
One thing I would say, Brad, as you know, we've spent a lot of time looking at signaling. In the mobile network, it's not just about the bearer throughput, it's actually the signaling load you put in there. So that's why this is a more subtle issue than just saying unlimited plan, because it can't be an unlimited signaling plan, because that actually would bring the network down. So a lot of the applications misbehave in the signaling domain, actually, more than they misbehave in the bearer domain. So this is a rich space where the idea of just saying, that an unlimited everything is good and have that sort of market architecture is too facile, because in fact you cannot have unlimited signaling because the radio controller actually has a limited algorithm that allocates its resources. So that has to be limited in some way, which gets back to David's suggestion, which we looked at, of AT&T actually works with application developers to say, here's how you can better utilize the radio network resources and still provide the service you want to provide. So I think it's actually a combination of Brad's desire and David's suggestion is actually a good direction to move in.
But I think there's another, and I think there's another, I would put this as a engineering question or a mechanism design question. You referred to sending price signals, and I think some of our economist friends would agree that sending price signals is a good thing. But to me, one of the benefits of the unlimited plan is precisely that it tries not to send a price signal, because that facilitates some user behavior. And in this case, if you're sending the price signal to the user as opposed to the application developer, I think most people are uncomfortable with the idea of sending the price signal to the application developer because they don't know what that would look like, and they're uncomfortable with the application having to pay to use. But I don't know how to equate the idea of sending a price signal to the user and giving him an unlimited plan, and that's the thing that I struggle with, because I'd like to preserve the unlimited plan. So I think there's an interesting mechanism design question lurking in there.
We have a session a little bit later today where we'll be discussing data caps and other forms of pricing. So I think some of these comments may be coming up again during that session, so I'll sort of hold my comments on that point until then. I just wanted to sort of comment about this, the specifics of this case versus, the risk of generalizing too broadly from the specifics of this case. Carriers, application developers, and consumers all benefit from innovation in the application space. It drives more demand for mobile devices, which drives the subscribership, which describes and usage of the services that the carriers are offering. So I think there is a strong incentive that AT&T and our competitors have in the mobile space of encouraging application innovation. And Dave, to your point earlier, one of the things we discussed actually 2 meetings ago in the mobile broadband group, we have been extraordinarily proactive in trying to work directly with application developers to help them build better mobile applications. That's been one of the focuses actually in my group over the last couple of years, is to, because application developers typically have either grew up in the world of fixed internet, or they're 20 years old and this is the first application they've ever written. It's one or the other. So, and the complexities of building in the mobile environment present a unique set of challenges. So we've been trying to encourage network-friendly design and battery-friendly design, to Brad's point. The The specifics of this case is a little different. There's not, I think that the chill to investment argument really does not hold. Apple provided mechanisms to carriers to limit the plans under which the application would be provided. So this is a case where there's a dominant player in the industry that's making a mechanism available. It's not a case where it's a small upstart application developer that was somehow inhibited from bringing innovation to the marketplace. So I do want to make that the specifics of this case, I think, don't demonstrate that this sort of carriers are acting in a way that discourages innovation.
On that point about the specifics of this case, I think it is really interesting. The salient fact being, or one of them being, that the app came from Apple, as you described, with that functionality, and it was bundled, and who knows how much choice there was in that context either. But it sort of leads me to another question, which will likely be for another time. But what happens when there are technologies that are bundled into the phone? As in, let's take WebRTC, for example, that is coming, and that will be an inherent part of all rendering engines that will allow the same two-way communications, that opens it up even more. So it's not so much application specific, but now it's just a part of the environment. And then perhaps a question for us to look at would be, what behaviors would we expect from the ecosystem players in that environment under the open internet order? That might be something for us to pursue. It's one idea. And when I say coming as in now. So.
Great question. Alyssa?
Yeah, I wanted to go back a little bit on this question about price signals, because we also talked about, in the subgroup, we talked about some non-price signals that you could use under an unlimited plan that would effectuate potentially similar outcomes. So in the report, we talk a little bit about rate limits based on how much volume users use or even how much congestion that they cause. And I think that that's a potential avenue where you say, if you want to maintain the ability to offer an unlimited plan, but each user gets a certain quota of congestion that they can cause during the peak period, and after that happens, then they get sent to the back of the queue, or they get rate limited, that kind of thing. That can create the same kind of discipline, both for users and for application developers who don't want to be the cause of users getting throttled, as a price signal potentially. And so I think there's actually a broader space if you're concerned about charging people for how much data they use, or charging them for causing congestion in the dollar sense. You can actually charge them another way, in the bit sense. And I don't think we should write those things off, even though there's not a lot of usage of those kinds of mechanisms yet. I think they create really potentially good incentives for application developers to think about how they moderate their network usage, and for consumers to respond to those signals.
So I wonder if we should see if our friends on the airwaves have anything they want to say. Dennis or Jessica, just an invitation if you have anything you want to add. This could be a time to do it. Perhaps one of you is engaging in a home renovation project from the sound up. So we'll just bring the speaker back down again, and you can signal as we go if there's more you want to say. So that being the case, first I think we really owe thanks to this working group for being able to work through these difficult issues. It, I think, is both awkward and, in the event, very helpful that AT&T was both a subject of the case study and a member of this committee and this working group. I think that it's had lots of implications, but most of them extremely positive for getting this kind of format off and running. And I just want to note that and thank AT&T for being willing to be the guinea pig in this regard. My thought is that we can pull ourselves right now simply to see if there's more work the working group ought to be doing on this particular case study, or if we should basically put it in the can. The intent then would be we can roll it in later to an annual report that we'll plan to have ready over the summer to mark the anniversary of the committee, and to just figure out now, is there more that needs to be done on this, or should the working group, the mobile working group, be turning to the next agenda item? Are there thoughts on that from the committee?
I think it's pretty stable.
Pretty stable, a stable build, as it were, a stable release. Yep, David?
Well, I have a general opinion, which is when you do one case study, you may think you've learned something. When you do two, you discover they're inconsistent and you haven't learned anything. By the time you do three, the larger world may be coming into focus. So,
Are you suggest? Oh, I see. It gets better after the second, is what you're saying.
Right. So, without saying that you're done, I think going on to another one may give you more perspective. And if eventually you came back to this, it would be with a larger sense of the question you might have asked. So, I would certainly say, in general, from a process point of view, I would urge you to go look at another case and then see what you're learning out of it, but without saying it's done. Stable build, I like that. Right.
Any thoughts on this question, or does that represent the consensus of the committee?
I have one question, which is, could you enumerate, I mean, I've heard two things enumerated that haven't been answered. Another case study to compare it against, which I'm reminded as a statistician, once you have 2 points, you can fit a line to it. And then the other remark, which was you stopped very deliberately at a place which we talked about earlier, about not making recommendations. Could you enumerate, was there any other deliberate place you stopped? Want to enumerate that?
I think that was the main question. I mean, it was really whether we tried to interpret the order or not, and we felt ill-equipped to do that, and also reluctant to do it in this on such a specific case study. But I don't recall. I don't know if anyone else in the group has an opinion. I don't recall any other such decision. I mean, I suppose the only other thing was that we eventually agreed to disagree on the final conclusions because there really were disparate views, and we felt those disparate views were legitimate, that they weren't just limited to the fact that the committee members had different opinions, but that the ecosystem, people in different parts of the ecosystem might also have different opinions. So we, in the interest of getting something done and helping flesh out the space, we chose to summarize 3 viewpoints rather than continuing to duke it out to get to a single viewpoint, because we didn't think we'd actually succeed in doing that.
If I might, just, in addition, there was a remark made earlier about the value added of what you did, which is to say, you learned for your own motive, you had your own motives to try to learn about this example and then infer limited generality from it. I also am very curious, by performing this analysis, did you make public, because we've now made this public, multiple viewpoints that were not potentially appreciated in the public domain previously?
That's a great point. I think it relates to something Marcus said, that that this actually is a pretty complicated space, and I think we all came to a fair amount of agreement that there's a lot of nuance here, and I think a lot of the press on this particular topic was quite stratified. Between people that were staunchly advocating for application developers and staunchly advocating for carriers. And so I think we all came to a sense that it is a complicated issue, and a lot of these details matter. Some of those details weren't as highlighted as much in the press as they are perhaps in our report. But I'd be curious for other members of the group to comment on that.
To your other question about aspects that aren't necessarily addressed, I think we didn't get too much into some of the questions that were raised in some of the reporting about which plans have access and whether, being unlimited, having to have a shared plan where you're forced to pay for data and you're also forced to buy a voice package with the mobile share plan when perhaps you're buying it so that you can use FaceTime and not ever have to use voice, and all of the kind of business plan details are not really reflected too much, I would say.
I would just like to say I like to think of this as a snapshot in time as opposed to being finished, because everything is changing. Technology is changing, businesses, marketing is changing. So 6 months from now, a lot of the information here may be different.
At the very least, we should have a date stamp on the on the report as being received today.
It would be very useful, because this is all going to change within a year.
Yeah. Well, and it brings to mind David's point that once you've got a few of these under the belt, then the act of being able to go back and see the breadcrumbs that each one represents having dropped can be really helpful. So, all right, with that said then, just another hearty thank you to the working group for bringing this forward, for lodging this report. As I said, we'll roll it into our records. It's now open to the public. Be curious to see what we hear. Should also say, we have bundled public comment all at the end of the session today. That will mean that any public comment can be about any part of the agenda, and let's just hope we're not too captured by the psychological recency effect that all the comments will be about whatever came last. There's opportunity, of course, to range over the whole thing. So Jennifer, thank you again for your leadership in working this through and bringing it to bear. Okay, that now shifts us into a check-in with Russ and the Transparency Working Group. Russ, over to you.
Thank you. The Transparency Working Group encourages the FCC to promote a logo program for both mobile and fixed services. The proposed logo would be accompanied by 3 numbers: download speed, upload speed, and price. These numbers are very far from a complete picture of the internet service offering, yet they seem to be at the right level of detail for most consumers. In addition, the service provider should provide a much more complete disclosure like the one recommended by BEREC. These details are vital for expert analysis and service offering comparison. The Transparency Working Group fully recognizes that this approach ignores latency, jitter, impacts of over-provisioning, and other important technical factors. The Transparency Working Group also recognizes that determining the price is not straightforward, especially when other services are bundled with an internet service, such as in a triple play offering. While the Transparency Working Group recognizes that mobile data networks are rapidly evolving, fixed and mobile connections are both a significant part of today's network experience. For this reason, we believe that service providers that do not provide access to the whole internet should not be eligible for such a logo. This committee is, after all, about the open internet. The Transparency Working Group notes that a number of other groups are working on topics that overlap with the Transparency Working Group. And we intend to, but have not yet, canvassed these groups for additional perspectives. We expect that we will report at a future meeting what we learn from these groups. And our plan is to report in May on that. So we would like to hear what other members of the advisory committee think about this recommendation or proposed recommendation, and want to use this time to get that input.
Well, we should open that up for questions and comments within the committee, recognizing that we've allocated not the longest slot for this, but a very concrete idea. I'm opening it up. Either people on the working group or not on the working group.
So I had provided some of these comments earlier. I don't know by email. I don't know whether they were other folks saw them, but I'll just present them verbally here. So I mean, I think we all have a very strong commitment to transparency, and in fact, there are some discussion came up in the email thread about work that's going on in IETF and Broadband Forum about transparency at the level of the types of performance measurements perhaps that could be disclosed. And obviously, I think one would want to make sure they're disclosed in a way that is understandable by a consumer, which, you know, there's obviously a need to really look at whether that's happening today. That said, I have I don't agree with the specifics of the recommendation. The logo idea, I think, really has some implications that need to be explored. I know it started as a notion of like an Energy Star logo, which, Energy Star is a voluntary program that manufacturers participate in, which puts an appliance in a laboratory in a controlled environment and tests it against certain parameters. I think the complexity of the services that we're dealing with really mitigates against something quite that simplistic. Just the specifics of what might go into the transparency. An example was given of about price. As an example, I put forward the notion of imagine two ISPs, both of whom provide essentially identical services in terms of speed, etc. And as tiered pricing or whatever may be very, very similar in terms of the level at which caps are applied, if that exists. One ISP actually has significantly better customer service than the other, and therefore will have a higher price. The argument that's being put forward here about publishing this small set of specific characteristics, I think ultimately could allow the logo or the brand to have the essentially what is the less capable ISP look better in the eyes of the consumer, because the customer service is not one of the characteristics that was looked at. Ultimately, what price reflects in the marketplace is a consumer's idea of value. And value is across a very broad range of capabilities that, as the report actually alludes, go far beyond just the basics of the quote broadband internet service itself. The consumer may be reflecting the customer service experience. They may be reflecting their appreciation of some of the specialized services that are offered in addition to the broadband internet experience. And that's what the marketplace is intended to do. It's intended to allow consumers to essentially vote with their wallet and reward those companies that are providing services that provide value to them with their business. So my belief is that we absolutely as a group should look very, very hard at the performance-related issues and the detailed characteristics of the plans to make sure that what ISPs are providing is clearly described and is essentially that the service agreements are met, are adhered to. This is a role that the FCC has traditionally played from the earlier days of the telephone industry. But I personally would not be supportive of an Energy Star-like logo or a particular matrix of things that includes things like price.
Yeah, following on Chuck's point, I mean, I think back to the earlier discussion, the complexity of this space does not lend itself to a simplistic approach. In fact, it will be, you'll get consequences you don't expect. I'll give one example. Pandora, an application we all know, actually, when optimized, consumes less bandwidth when it appropriately uses signaling resources, etc. So you could argue that advertising raw throughput would actually not allow an optimization, or a consumer might say, I'll choose the higher throughput ISP, when in fact a lower throughput ISP with control of signaling or caching, who's worked with the application developers, would be the better offer. And I'm just taking that as a canonical example where the naked throughput in a wireless network in particular, wireline you could argue has some differences there, but the naked throughput in a wireless network is in fact too simplistic. It is a parameter, but it is the control of signaling, the support for caching, and the bandwidth that would actually be the correct sort of characterization that would allow a consumer to judge what sort of experience they were going to have, not just how many megabits per second. So.
David? When you're trying to figure out what to do in this space, there are a couple of other analogies that have been put forward. One is the nutrition label, which can have more than one number in it. It can have a series of things. You know, you've got so much bandwidth and so much, well, latency is the wrong way to think about it, but I think some people have looked at the nutrition label and couldn't really make that work either. The other one is the sort of consumers reports model, where they make a decision that there are 5, 6, 7 things that they're going to measure about something, but they can be completely incomparable. You can have a column for quality of customer service, and you can have a column for quality of user experience running 2 or 3 specific apps, and then you get the nice red circle or the dreaded black circle. And they don't try to quantify it too precisely. They throw you into one of 5 buckets from red to black, and over time they change the buckets too. So now, of course, the nice thing about that, if nice is a suitable word, is it's done by a third party. It's voluntary. If you don't want to look at their website, you can go look at somebody else's website. There's always a risk if somebody is actually standardizing this and saying, well, we're the FCC, we're going to tell you what those buckets are. It sort of makes the whole thing, there's a fear it would make the whole thing too rigid and not voluntary. But this seems like a good space for, to me, it seems like a good space for a voluntary activity, and it seems to me the thing that might make the most sense to a consumer would be something that looks sort of like a consumer's report thing, where you get a red star for bandwidth and a black box, a black circle for latency, and you know, you get a neutral circle for experience listening to radio, and as I say, it's voluntary, and it's done by third party. I'm sorry, it's not voluntary. The ISPs have no control over where Consumer Reports rates them, you know. But
I confess I've never understood the Consumer Reports iconography. I think just brains worked differently in 1954, so that a half-full black donut meant something. But
there's a name, by the way, there's a name for those, but I can't remember what it is. But I think a lot of people still think that makes sense. Yes, your brain may be different.
Yes. Right. But I guess there's both, of course, as the working group, I think, has quickly discovered, there's a lot of things that transparency could apply to and mean. And of course, there's a lot of things, as it's just been pointed out, a label could apply to and mean. So those are 2 very hard things to pin down. On the transparency front, it may be that transparency of practices is sort of the zeroth thing to really help not just the public, but say the FCC as it's trying to figure out how to deal with the space and whether to deal with the space, just to know what practices are taking place out there. And our prior case study maybe is a good example of there was some transparency of practice, so people knew FaceTime was not functioning under these circumstances and basically who was behind it. That's a form of transparency that may be unrelated to a label. That's just sort of an ongoing commitment. And I guess I note the Open Internet Order calls for that sort of transparency both in the wireless and wireline spaces. There's also sort of transparency of contents, like what's inside the tin. I think that's the nutrition label that David was talking about. That may be the kind of thing that Sam knows, that project within the FCC was trying to do, to really try to measure with its boundedness understood just how well a network is working when it's almost like the contents of the tin will change over time. It's a lot harder to label a service than it is possibly to label a product, particularly if what the service gives you depends on how other users might be using it at that moment. And I guess on the label part, maybe there is the purpose of a label could be to occasion a non-regulatory push to a certain ideal. That might be no mercury inside the tin. It'd be few people who want mercury with their fish. And then for others, it's just more about choices. You know, somebody says there's no gluten in this. Half the people get very excited, at least around these parts, and the other half of the people, you know, wouldn't touch it. So it's just helping people make good decisions. And I imagine a further might be a cigarette label, which is just trying to make you not smoke the cigarette. That's the purpose of the label. So anyway, all of this is to say, I can imagine it would be really helpful to be specific about the aim the label is trying to accomplish and just how readily that could be done and which form of transparency is being sought among the choices. Russ?
So there's actually 2 aspects to this proposed recommendation. And the first is the logo is aimed at consumers so that they can make somewhat informed choices when more than one offering is available. And the second is that the coupling of that with a more complete disclosure using the BE-REC format provides a template so that these disclosures are not all in different formats, making it easier for an apples-to-apples comparison as opposed to where we have today, where there's no common format used, so comparisons are extremely difficult and require a significant amount of expertise. So I think both of those need to be coupled when considering this. And the other aspect of this is if the FCC is to promote a logo program as opposed to mandate a logo program.
I should also ask if anybody on our phone bridge has anything he or she wants to say. Jessica and Dennis, anything, or going once, twice? Alyssa.
Yeah, so I think one of the nice things about the work that BEREC has done, the group of European regulators, is that they have actually gone out and done a bunch of research about how consumers understand the information that is already out there today and the way that standardized notices might impact their search for broadband products. And so I think having that kind of data is helpful because while the products may be complex, it may still be the case that consumers are basing their choices on simple factors like price and speed. And so providing a label is sort of a means to meet that need. Even if you don't think the label accurately reflects the complexity of the product, it may be the case that no matter what you do, consumers treat this as a simple choice. And so giving them a simple way to reduce their search costs might be something that you would want to do to help them out. But I would be interested in hearing a little bit about the committee's the subgroup's rationale about which factors were included, particularly because I think, with the Measuring Broadband America work, we're starting to have standardized measures across many of the larger ISPs for things other than download speed and upload speed. And I'm definitely thinking specifically of latency. I think there's a good constituency out there that believes that latency is much more important for the performance of particular applications, certainly above a particular speed threshold. And so, I've been in a lot of rooms where people have talked about, if we could only get speedtest.net to focus more on latency and stop reporting to people their speed, then you might be able to fix some of these things in the network that are creating latency problems, buffer bloat, and so forth. So I would be interested to hear why, up and down speed were chosen to the exclusion of other metrics.
I don't know that we have time for that discussion
Some other
publicly
day.
right now, but I mean, I take Russ's opener as really just helping that working group hone its agenda and work. So I think that's a really great question to be feeding back to them. I think Matt had wanted to get in and then maybe wrap up with David had also wanted. Oh, David has retracted.
Kevin's been very patient over there. I think I'm going to defer to Kevin
I'm
first.
sorry, Kevin. So Matt yields his time to you, and then probably we'll ask for it at the end.
So I want to comment real quickly on the latency element. The one thing about latency is it's very subjective. Latency to where? So I think that's going to be a much more complex type of measurement that gets put on any potential label. The other comment is there are things within transparency and disclosure which are pretty straightforward. Things like management practices and things that are fairly fixed. I think the speed one is going to be a little bit more difficult because who puts that in? Everybody's 12 meg service doesn't always deliver 12 meg. So I feel that the Measuring Broadband America report is really a good fundamental measurement shows measurement, shows benchmarks around that versus having some sort of label that it would be very difficult to come up with consistently across providers.
I was just going to add on a little bit. One of the things that's, as a network operator, one of the big things that affects the user experience is also the oversubscription ratio of how far over the capacity of your network you're going to sell. And if you oversell too much, you end up with the broadband equivalent of a busy signal, or very slow connection, or very high latency. And we don't really have, at least I haven't seen any really good data points on that. I have some anecdotal evidence. You know, a typical cell site's going to have multiple thousands of people on a sector. You know, a DSLAM's going to have however many people on a DSLAM. Cable system's going to have X number of people on a typical cable node, and then you can extend it out to the middle mile, and you can extend it out to where they connect up to the internet. It's a complex thing, and I don't know how we address that in here, but I do think it's an important factor that we need to be considering as we go through this.
Yeah. And I guess there's a difference between it being very complicated and maybe different audiences having different criteria by which they would make a choice, and you wouldn't want to steer people the wrong way because of an overgeneralization about what people want. Some people want a gaming profile for their connection, others want just to use email. It calls to mind the FCC's need for speed little test that you can go through, which I find myself just saying, yes, I'd like speed, please, now what? But the fact that it's complicated is a different claim than that it is unknowable. This is not like at the quantum level, we don't know how the network works. It just will vary a lot over time and circumstance, and there are multiple data points, and if there are too many, it may be very hard to come up with a single label that describes it. But it's not like we don't know what's inside the tin. It's just different people have different thoughts about that.
But David, I think the thing is we don't know whether it's good for you or not, right? With the nutritional body of work, in fact, you could claim users don't know if it's good for them. I think there are people who know whether it's good for them, but I think we spend a lot of time educating users about the things that are good and bad for them on that nutritional label. And I think we've first got to do the educational work on what's good and bad for you. Is latency good for you or bad for you? Is bandwidth good or bad for you? Is signaling behavior on a mobile network good or bad for you? I mean, I think it's until you've educated people about the numbers that matter, you can't have a meaningful label, is my concern. It's essentially like just putting calories on there and saying that all that matters is calories. And that encourages the wrong behavior for those who have gluten allergies or have a high salt problem or whatever. So I think we need to be much more nuanced and talk about the experiences that they're looking to have and then say, is this a good service for this type of experience?
I feel like there's
last comment, yes.
I feel like there's almost a weights and measures approach that might be relevant here. Perhaps the role that we can play is to come up with a consistent way to measure latency or throughput or whatever it is, and not to require that anybody measure it. But it's just that, you know, when you use a meter, when you measure a distance in a meter, you know, the NIST has a definition of what a meter is, and everyone agrees about that.
Yes.
And you can choose to say that your product is 2 meters long or not. But when you claim it, it's a fact. And maybe that's the role we have here, is some definitions that Consumer Reports and speed test and other people can use to make measurements that consumers can pick and choose from.
Yes.
And the right measurements will out at the end. And what matters here is that we don't have two people disagreeing about what the measurement of latency is as to some of the points. To whom do you measure latency, and how does it work? Maybe that's more of a role we can play.
And this gets back to David's observation that possibly having consistency in category can really help. And I'm glad you used the meter metaphor rather than the kilogram metaphor for apparently the kilogram is not known just how much it weighs anymore. It's too bad.
Jonathan, I just want to throw one thing in before we close this, and that is that we've heard a lot of discussion here about the complexity of the problem, and I think all of us would acknowledge that. But that's also been true in other areas where the government has asked vendors to provide more data and to publish data. And when you publish the data, what that does is create a forcing function to work through those complexities to come up with something of a consensus. Avoiding publishing the data because it's complex doesn't seem to be the right answer.
All right. On that inconclusive but important note, we should bookend this conversation and shift gears to check in with our Specialized Services Working Group. For that, I turn it over to David Clark.
I have some slides, so you should tell me.
This appears not to be your deck.
Say again?
Oh, there you go.
You want me to come over there? Is that the best thing to... Ah, the magic clicker. Thank you. we did not succeed in. Okay. We did not succeed in producing a written report, but with great debate, we succeeded in producing a slide deck that I think most of us agreed to. So I'm going to go through this, and this will take me a little while. The report in order and in the notice of proposed rulemaking that comes before it introduced a term of specialized services. And one of the specific, in fact, there's an instruction in the report in order that there be an open internet advisory committee. That's why we exist. And one of the tasks we are given is to look at, and I'll come back to what it means to look at, this particular issue of specialized services. And this subgroup was the one that bought that part of the agenda. I think that our job as interpreting the report in order is to clarify the meaning of specialized services, and I'm going to spend some time talking about that, review and advise the criteria which were used to define it, and then to try to give some advice to the FCC about this problem in general, this problem area, which I'll try to define. So this is derived from, what I'm going to say is derived from the report in order. It comes from a reading of the report in order. And I think I should just say up front that I don't mean to ding anybody here, but the committee or the subgroup struggled for a long time, and the reason it struggled is that, to be honest, the definition of specialized services that you find in the report in order is not as clear as you might like. And so we spent a lot of time trying to avoid being ultimately Talmudic about it, but we're trying to figure out what does it actually say. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But the reason that the report in order identified the category of specialized services was to be able to talk about the following two issues. And one of them is that a service provider could offer something and call it a specialized service, which is, of course, a term that only came into existence in the context of this proceeding. But by calling it a specialized services, they could try to evade the requirements of the open internet order. And that means we have to answer a question: when is a specialized service, and when is it something that comes within the scope of the order? And the second issue that's within the report in order is the concern that broadband providers might put all of the capacity of the network into selling specialized services and not enough capacity into the internet products. So the internet product it would be, sorry, am I doing something wrong here to this microphone, or just, okay. That the quality of the internet service might erode over time. And that's actually specifically in the report in page 61. So I'm going to start by going through this question of defining what specialized services means. There is some text. This is a paraphrase from the report. Specialized services are services offered by broadband providers, that's an important restriction, that share capacity over the last mile facility. In particular, we're looking at last mile facilities here. And examples which come from the report are some user-facing services such as video, voice over IP or IP video. That's called out on page 61. Some of these other things are in the report. So you get the idea here, but if you try to clarify this, we found all kinds of confusion. And so what I'm offering you here is what I'm taking as our working definition. I think the FCC was comfortable with this. They weren't prepared to say that we were right. That might have given this too much weight. We're an advisory committee. We don't speak for the FCC. We give them advice. But the thing I want to stress is that the term specialized services really emerged within the discourse that came up to the report in order, starting with the notice of proposed rulemaking. And so you want to see the term specialized services as being meaningful only within this context. And one way to think about it is that the report in order talks about internet services, which are things covered by the report in order, and they needed a word to talk about everything else. So it's sort of the negation of what an internet service is. And the qualification seems to be that it's IP-based and it's over the physical access path coming into your house. So this is not a new category. This is not like we just invented Title 13 of the Act, which covers specialized services. It is everything else, And what that means in terms of implications is that within this basket, this open-ended everything else basket, which is called specialized services, you maybe find services which, if you look at some other part of what the FCC does, are covered by some other regulation. So I think the regulatory status of voice over IP or voice over the internet is a little ambiguous right now, but the point is, with respect to this circumstance, voice over IP, if it is not over the top but is provided as a separate service, is a specialized service. That doesn't say anything about its regulatory burden. So the definition is relevant with respect to answering only one question, which is, when does a service cease to be a specialized service and fall under the requirements of the Open Internet Report and Order? Now, we called this finding the boundary, and we believe that if you read the report and order, you come up with the following two criteria. The first one is that it looks like an internet, and therefore it ought to be covered by the report and order if the following two conditions hold. First one is it's a general service. It's a service like IP on which higher level services can run. In contrast, if it's a user level service like telephony, that in and of itself looks like a specialized service. But if it is a general service, sort of like the internet, then the second question is, does it reach most or all of the endpoints of the internet? So if you find that there is a platform service like IP, and for example, it gets to every country except Zimbabwe, and somebody were to say, this was the word that the FCC used to describe this was evasion, that it is not an internet service, so it's not covered by the report and order because it's a general platform. It runs like IP, but you can't get to Zimbabwe, so it's not the internet. They said, no, that's evasion. That looks like it's equivalent and it's going to be covered. So you get these two criteria that can be found in the report and order. So I think our task is as follows. I think that, it's possible people could ask all kinds of questions about exactly what the report and order says. And in fact, I've read it fairly carefully. I read it again on the plane coming out. There are some places in there that are a little ambiguous. I don't think our job is to try to continue to refine that definition. And in fact, I think that there are going to be a lot of people who are advocating for one or another position. Various pleadings may come up. There are going to be a lot of other people who do the same thing. I think we should generalize our job a little bit and say, are these criteria going to end up making a distinction that is in the best interest of the various groups that are served here, the consumer, the innovator, the ISP, and so forth? And our approach to this, I think, is to stop trying to focus on the definition and to stop talking about it abstractly and to look at some case studies. And we haven't picked the case studies, but let me just point out a few of the things that you might look at. For example, if you look at IPTV, IPTV itself was, in the report and order, identified as something that could be a specialized service. It looks like a user-facing service. It's not an internet service, but it runs on some sort of internet service. It runs on top of an IP platform. So when is it a specialized service and when it's not actually has to do more with the IP platform that it runs on rather than the service itself. And when you get down to things like I'm not going to go through this list. I'm just saying there are all kinds of things here that we hope will shed some light on this distinction. The other issue that the FCC brought up, which I alluded to earlier in the talk, is what we call this capacity issue. Is the capacity allocated to the internet adequate, or is the emergence of specialized services somehow squeezing out the capacity for the internet? The FCC clearly has a high-level goal. They've articulated this, which is that higher-level service developers should be able to innovate concerns about a gatekeeper without uncertainty. This comes up in a lot of contexts. We heard it earlier today. And part of what the report and order is trying to do is to protect this free innovation in the context of the public internet. But if, in fact, all the capacity were shifting from the public internet to specialized services, then there's an obvious question, which is, does the fact of specialized services which are running on IP but not the public internet raise concerns with respect to this goal? So that's the high-level framing of the question. Saying that more specifically, you could imagine specialized services are competing with the internet capacity in such a way that, and again, I'm being as careful as I can, and it's not careful enough. material classes of internet applications are not viable. Now, in the extreme, people have talked about this as the internet information highway becoming the dirt road and so forth. But notice just a couple of issues here. One of them is this doesn't relate to any specific specialized service, but it relates to the overall character of the innovative space, including the open internet and the specialized services as well. And I think the FCC's question, which is more or less in the report and order, is are there competitive concerns that arise from the way the underlying capacity is managed? The report specifically says that what the FCC is going to do in this space is monitor this activity. And I think one of the things that our group needs to do is to help the FCC, and by the way, the report tells us to do that. The report says that the Open Internet, Advisory Committee should help them understand what it means to monitor this space. So I think that's part of our job. If you look at some of the monitoring going on today, like Measure Broadband America, you could say, well, is this answering the question that needs to be answered? And that's what we could talk about. So we've talked in the committee about two ways to think about this, and neither of them makes us feel very good, or at least I'm speaking for myself there. I don't feel very good about either one of them. And one of them is you could say, how much internet is enough? And all of the conversations we've heard here earlier about what are the dimensions, what are the metrics, how would you measure it, you'd have to answer that question so that the FCC can say, yes, the internet service is good enough that we don't feel there's a problem here. And of course, the definition has to change over time. Another way to think about it is to say, well, look at what's being done in the space of specialized services today, generally, not a specific service, and compare it to what's being done on the internet and see whether it looks as if there is a significant set of opportunities that are being exploited. So that's sort of pragmatic. Look for what's already happening. Are there innovative opportunities that are being exploited by the service providers which are not available to people who would like to innovate on top of the open internet? And that makes the situation even more complicated because not just raw capacity, but, for example, issues like quality of service come up, as I'll illustrate in a minute. So let me just put up a couple of conundrums to help you understand why this is hard. If you look at something like a cable system, and I want to be clear, we're not just talking about cable. This would arise in the context of Fios or fiber to the home generally, or Google in Kansas City, or a lot of the television today on cable's not IP-based, it's in QAMs, which is a different modulation scheme. But a lot of it's going to move to IP. So once you find all of the entertainment product moving to IP, by the definition of the FCC, it is a specialized service. And a lot of telco TV today is on IP, so that's a specialized service. And if you look at the way facilities are operated today, what I'm calling traditional TV in quotes here, consumes a large majority of the overall capacity of a provider's access. So if we look at a cable system, an awful lot of it's being used to deliver television. So if you looked at, for example, today's systems, and I say today because if I put fiber to the home, this statement, and I built it out in a very aggressive way, this statement might not automatically be true. It's hard to imagine allocating to the public internet product sufficient capacity that some over-the-top provider could offer television in exactly the same way that the facilities owner does. On the other hand, if you look at the competitive landscape today, I'd say that the cable guys and their telephone company, Kin, are getting an awful lot of competition from over-the-top video. We talk about cable cutters and, and cord cutters and cable virgins and so forth. So there's a lot of competition going on here, but with different capacity allocations. So what that says is if you just looked at raw numbers and said, well, what percentage of the capacity was allocated to specialized services and what percentage of the capacity was allocated to the internet, that's not a useful question to ask. It's going to have to be a more complicated question than that, and that makes us hurt. So there's no obvious bright line here, and we struggle. I raised this as a conundrum, and a lot of people said, oh, just unsay that. But I'll leave the slide in the deck. And again, I said imagine cable systems today because in another context, I'm actually dealing with this problem in the build-out of advanced broadband in Western Massachusetts. What we've noticed is that there are a lot of little mom-and-pop cable franchises that aren't offering internet service today. They're still single-direction, analog, sort of 1990 cable systems. And if one of them came along and said, well, maybe I will put this DOCSIS stuff in, whatever it is, I'll offer you 1 megabit a second down and 400 kilobits up. Isn't that what the FCC had to do or something like that? Well, how would you think about that? Would you say, well, that's better than nothing? Or would you say, no, that's a poor internet service. Boy, you're giving all your capacity to the specialized services. And they could say, well, I won't give you any. So maybe you call it internet, but you can't call it broadband. You're in a horrible definitional space here, which somehow you'd like to get out of. And it relates to this issue of metrics and measurements and so forth. I want to talk about quality of service because I mentioned it on a previous slide. And I want to distinguish between voice over IP, which is, for example, what you get if you buy telephony from a company like a cable company today, a Comcast or Time Warner, or a telco that's moved on from copper pairs. You get voice over IP, but the IP service that it's running on is not the public internet, right? It is a separately, it's got a separate reachability characteristic. You have IP addresses there and you have IP addresses on the public internet. They're mutually not reachable, or at least that's the way it's supposed to work. And when you buy that service, one of the things that they say is, this has got good quality of service. You don't get dropouts, it's properly provisioned, we make that service work well, it's going to be just like your telephone. If you contrast this with what I'm calling voice over internet, where you might look at things like Vonage or Skype, which is a closed system, but it's used by an awful lot of people to talk to each other, they don't have any way to say about the platform on which they run, the public internet platform, that they can offer you the quality of service that you might get with a service that's been provisioned specifically for voice over IP. And so are they disadvantaged? Are they disadvantaged in a way that the FCC should be concerned about? Is this an issue? Or is this, well, everything's good enough, there's no problem here? Okay. Here's another one that we came up with. It was another case study we looked at briefly. It was illustrated by a particular online game called EVE Online. And one of the developers of EVE Online said publicly, if he could pay ISPs from the producer side, from the game side, to get enhanced quality of service for his users, he would do it because it would improve the quality of gameplay. And from his point of view, this would be pro-consumer, this would be pro-innovator, because it would mean his game would work better. And today, I think a lot of people look at the lack of quality of service on the internet as a leveling of the playing field. And this has been debated in the context of the public internet. Is this a good idea or is it a barrier to innovation? But just here's a hypothetical. Imagine Eve came to major ISPs and said, well, why don't you build us a low-level specialized service, which is IP-based, it's consumer-facing, and then sell us access to that and we'll run our game on it. Would that then, because it's an IP service and it's reaching perhaps many parts of the consumer space, we said, no, that's not a specialized service, that's an internet service, it would have to be covered by the report and order. Would this change your thinking? How would you think about Eve if it was running on top of something that was created to be an IP service that had quality of service? So I think we have another task here, is to try to advise the FCC as to when the overall offerings of specialized services raise competitive concerns. And as I said, there's a specific instruction in the report and order that part of what this means is the FCC wants to monitor things and we need to help them understand what they should be monitoring. Now, as a process of doing this, we played a game and we tried to figure out in our conversation if there was anything that we could agree on, as opposed to writing a report that was nothing but multiple points of view. And there were some starting points, and these statements may look sort of motherhoodish, but they're not. These statements actually have to read them. The first one is regulation should not create a perverse incentive for operators to move away from a converged IP infrastructure. Everything's moving to IP. If there was a regulation that said, well, if you're running on top of IP, then we have these other 6 sticks we're going to beat you with over here, that might create a perverse incentive, just as certain definitions of performance might create perverse incentives. And using IP should not imply a regulatory burden related to any regulation of the internet. Now, one of the implications of this is a service should not be able to escape a regulatory burden or acquire a burden by moving to IP. That's actually a very strong statement, and people might want to challenge that, want to think about it. The other, of course, is to the extent possible, it would be nice if this was technology neutral. We're not just talking about, say, allocation of capacity on cable. We should be talking about how you would look in a technology independent way at a cable offering, a fiber to the home offering, maybe a DSL offering. I'm going to say there's some painful edge conditions in there, but we believe that to the extent possible, we should try to do this in a technology independent way. So what we're going to do going forward, I think, is address this question of looking at case studies to try to see if we can bring some clarity here, and to advise and to look at this question of what would it mean for the FCC to be monitoring this space. If that's what they're doing, how would we actually reduce that to practice?
Wow. Thank you, David.
Wow. Okay.
Wow.
I figured we struggled and brought forth something slightly larger than a medium-sized mouse. But,
No, just thank you for an incredibly lucid presentation and laying out of, as you say, a very complex field, but one for which there really is an agenda to make sense of it and to render some good advice on it. And that said, we have about 10 to 15 minutes to discuss it as a full committee. So I just want to encourage members to keep that in mind, and with that, open the floor for reactions. I think everybody's just sort of...
Does anybody in my subgroup wish to present a point of view? Because we certainly spent a lot of time talking about points of view.
Yes, Shane, and then...
I'll weigh in just by saying that, in the slide deck I'm going to present, we're going to overlap in some of the concerns. And one of the concerns that showed up in our conversation was the question, under what circumstances do these worries become more salient, and under what circumstances do these worries become less salient? So in other words, if you could define in advance when monitoring isn't really necessary, you'd save yourself a lot of trouble. And if you could define in advance the type of circumstances that would merit monitoring, you could focus attention quite a bit. And so that's a question we struggled with, and we struggled with, and I would say the question being the definition of when is a setting competitive and when is it not, and when is it in between, and when do users have many options and when not. And I'm not going to go into a large discussion of antitrust.
Good.
But that's the open question, and if you could resolve it, I would assert that helps quite a bit, right? Because in settings where there are a lot of options, then you don't have to do a whole lot of monitoring, and in settings where there aren't, then potentially you could focus resources. So.
Shane, I figure you were also possibly going to connect with your group's thinking about data caps, because there's maybe the question of data caps full stop, their role in things, but also differential data caps, because it might be that a specialized service could be defined as a service offered by somebody for which a cap that otherwise would apply doesn't apply, but otherwise is received in the ways that any other service is received.
Yeah, without presuming an outcome to the question.
Yeah, no, I don't presume one either.
But
that seems to bear very much on the specialized services question. Yeah.
David, is there any notion of essential services when it comes to specialized services?
I don't remember any such thing in the report and order. So we could ask two questions. One of them is it should, and the other is it there? Does anybody who's read this thing remember whether there's any mention of essential services and specialized services?
Can you repeat the question? It went by really quickly.
So I just asked about whether when we're talking about specialized services, whether the notion of essential services is there. Because when you went through your presentation, all I could think about was, is the notion that specialized services is there for something like making sure you can still make 911 calls or emergency situations, that, it's always functioning, versus a video game, if it was defined as a specialized service, being given a different set of rules?
I understand exactly what you're saying. I don't believe that the report and order specifically brings that up, but it's clearly an important point. A lot of for example, if you look at the commercial VoIP products that are being offered by over IP today, they are being offered as replacements for circuit copper pair telephony. And so in another room where the FCC's Technical Advisory Committee is having debates, one of the issues there is what expectations we should have about the quality of that product offering. Now, in that context, we don't use the words specialized service because that only applies to this report and order. But the question of to what extent we count on those packet-based services in the way we count on the telephone system today is absolutely on the table. It's just that's going on in some other room over there. And I don't think the two are tied together. They're not tied together through this report in order. That's a very technical answer, but I believe that's correct.
I think that's true too. Chip?
Yeah, thank you. Just to back up your question, I don't recall any discussion we had on essential services. And I think I have the same view as Dave just said. I don't recall reading it. It could have been there. I just might have missed it. I think there's an important point that was in the slide set, and I won't be able to phrase it exactly, but it's, what we talked about here doesn't relieve a service from any of its other regulatory obligations. So now my point I was going to make also was we did have some discussion, and I had a kind of maybe a slightly different way of looking at some of these is my view here is that voice over IP is a technology. It's not a service. So you can use voice over IP to offer services, but in and of itself, it's a technology. So that technology can be used to offer POTS, like a telephone service. It can be used to, in a gaming system, offer a voice chat side channel on a gaming system is voice over IP. So just saying voice over IP doesn't really give you an idea of what the actual service is. It does tell you what an idea of what technology is used there. So that's just my opinion on these. Another one is if you could put that slide up. That first and second one are interesting ones, and I don't think there are answers here, but there are things that we're going to be having to deal with for a long time. The second bullet especially is one that we dealt with quite a lot, and if you read the papers or anything, the WCIT was just held, or otherwise called WICIT, where they renegotiated the international telecom regulations. But that second bullet was a really, it wasn't necessarily phrased that way. It was one problem that we had to deal with for the last couple of years, and we're going to have to deal with going forward, which is a lot of the people that are looking at this issue are saying, a service shouldn't be able to escape regulatory burden or acquire burden by moving to IP. And that was on the mind of a lot of people in a lot of countries in terms of they have a regulatory structure in place for telephone service, and they're saying, well, just because it runs on IP doesn't mean these don't apply. Now, a lot of them went a little bit further and said because it runs over the internet, it shouldn't apply, which is has a whole different, set of problems, but it's all kind of the same set of issues that we're going to be dealing with as all of the traditional services move to IP. We're going to have to look at, well, what does this mean? And we don't have answers, but it is a key question. Thanks.
Melissa? And then Chuck?
No, it's okay.
Yeah, I was just kind of 2 points about the process that we've gone through so far and maybe some thoughts about moving forward. I think part of the difficulty that we've had sort of definitionally and just conceptualizing the issues here is that, David articulated the two concerns that are raised in the order and that we've discussed, one being this sort of evasion or, having a service that looks a lot like internet service but isn't quite and therefore doesn't come under the scope of the order, and the other one, this notion of bandwidth being constrained on the internet side as specialized services continue to grow. And I think when you think about a case study that would help you understand each of those problems, those are potentially two different services, like something that looks a lot like the internet. If we could find one of those or hypothesize one, is not going to necessarily be the same as looking at a particular provider's allocation of bandwidth between video and internet, which would help you with the sort of constraining squeeze question. And so I think focusing our discussions on which one of those are we talking about is maybe something that could be helpful in the future. And I'm glad that we've kind of figured out the distinction between those two things. But I think also with the monitoring, one conceptual difficulty is that we don't really know right now what specialized services are out there, what bandwidth is allocated to them, what quality of service capabilities they use, right? We don't even understand the status quo, at least I don't feel that I do, and I don't think we really do within the working group. And so I think before you can say, how do we help people monitor the space, it would be helpful to just understand the space today. And maybe that's something we can start to achieve through the case studies, but to me that would be another kind of level set that would be helpful.
I wonder how much of that information might be available with a good eye shade and a long day at the library and a terminal versus having to actually ask various companies. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
Chuck?
I just wanted to make one comment on the two QoS examples. It especially jumped out at me, Dave, when you were presenting the first QoS example. Your last question, should the FCC be concerned that these over-the-top providers do not have access to the quality of service of the VoIP offerings? And actually, I've turned the question around, is would we be allowed to offer quality of service to the voice-over internet providers on a non-discriminatory basis? I think, and I'm not an expert in this, but I believe that when AT&T merged with SBC, part of the consent that we made with the FCC was that we could not offer quality of service for internet applications to application providers. It was prohibited. So actually there's an ambiguity in my mind as to what we are allowed to do with respect to quality of service in this space. There has been some interesting discussion, for example, if a consumer wants to sign up for an application that uses quality of service, and they're making a proactive decision to sign up for that application, is that allowed? If a consumer, if a provider or an application provider makes a business arrangement with an ISP to provide enhanced quality of service for their application, and the consumer then signs up for that service, is that allowed? So there are a whole set of subtleties and nuances around what is and isn't permitted that I think actually we have to tease apart. And I suspect there's not agreement amongst everyone on this committee as to exactly what the right answer is, but I do believe that there's the question as you posed it actually has two sides, and I'm not sure that I know even at this point whether if in this case you mentioned Vonage wanted quality of service, whether we would be essentially legally permitted to offer it to them.
I guess, Chuck, something I might quickly tack on to your list of questions would be the use of intermediaries to accomplish something that might otherwise be prescribed, for better or worse. I mean, I feel like Akamai is a little bit of an elephant in the room, because if I'm EVE Online, I don't know how much Akamai can help me versus if I'm simply a video on demand provider or something. But my guess is they'd make the case they really could. Right. And then I'm writing them a check for better access to the subscribers far away. They, in turn, who knows what they're doing, but they're in some business relationship with whoever's running the head end. And it would almost be a corollary to David's second bullet here, that it shouldn't be that the presence of a third firm can make possible what wasn't possible before, or could make impossible. It just, you shouldn't be able to do some form of boundary arbitrage to get something done. So I feel like, I don't know if I've ever thought of something like an Akamai in terms of specialized services, but they are in the mix very much presently right now, and it also would bear upon the dirt road concerns, I think, that David's talking about.
Well, the flip side of that question with respect to an Akamai is what is most conducive to innovation and to creating more value for the consumer. So, I mean, I think obviously there are always arguments and concerns that can be expressed relative to market power, and I think some of what the tensions this group faces have to do with market power. But if in essence, certainly the way that the internet has proceeded so far, and the reason it is such a rich environment is that it's a relatively unfettered environment, and companies like Akamai can spring into being and deliver significant value both to the application providers whose content they're delivering, as well as in terms of the performance to the consumers that are the ultimate users of that content. So, again, my view is that we don't want to over-constrain the problem as a result of the discussions we have in this group.
We only have a couple minutes left. Let's see if there's any other. Yep. Neil?
I think we've talked about the two reasons to worry about or think about specialized services being regulatory burdens and squeeze and dirt road internets. And we've touched on, but not really tackled in any interesting way here, I think the question of anti-competitive behavior and the opportunity for perception of provision of a specialized service that competes with a third-party service delivered over the open internet. The example of data caps came up earlier, and that's, does the evasion of data caps by a specialized service provide a competitive advantage to a bundled service as opposed to an unbundled one? And I think that maybe is more appropriate in the economic impacts working group, but it certainly has tentacles that reach into this group too. So I just lay that on the table as something we haven't really confronted in gory detail.
Brad?
To Jonathan, challenging your notion that introducing a third party shouldn't change the game. I think to Neil's point about potential market power, if you've got somebody that has some essential facility like a line to the home and another provider who's out there in the ether and doesn't have that kind of leverage, maybe you should be looking at them differently in terms of what they can and can't do. And then the other side of that is just turning around the argument about FaceTime and bundling with the phone. You could argue that an independent provider isn't going to have the same impact if they provide something as one of the current incumbents that has a much bigger footprint in the marketplace. And so I think you can't necessarily say that introducing a third party doesn't change the game.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it would be worth, I think, thinking more about content distribution networks generally, what the competition looks like in that space, how much entering or exiting the space, how easy that is to do, or is the key to success in that space very specific, long negotiated, very close technical coordination sorts of things that make it a second and a half party rather than a third party sort of thing. I don't know. I mean, I ask truly out of curiosity rather than presuming I know the answer. Kevin, had you wanted to say something?
I think one of the challenges, the report and order, it's hard to know if it was purposely vague or it was just very difficult to define this, because the way, specialized services, it's almost like everything else. And when you say everything else, that things that have been there for 20 years, and
yes,
and it's also this is not a new problem, right? When you look at history, and I said this at the last meeting, but I'll repeat it. It used to be competition over right of ways. Then it was competition over fiber. Then it was competition of spectrum allocated on the fiber, and then it's frequencies, and now it's IP. So the whole concept of making sure that there's good allocation across services is not a new concept. And I think it's really the job of the committee to measure and benchmark the internet service and make sure that the products that are being offered are actually being delivered, that the internet continues to grow, in some benchmarks that we come up with to ensure that that piece of the service continues to prosper.
Which is to say, so long as the dirt road isn't a dirt road, a lot of the other worries maybe would fall away.
Yeah, because we're in a lot of what-if scenarios, and we can do that all day long, right? Versus the history of how it's gone so far and what our benchmarks are for the future.
We should wrap this up. David, I should just give you the last word. And also, Dennis and Jessica, if there's something you want to say. Presuming not. David?
What?
Sorry, I was just giving you the last word, if there's anything you wanted to say before you close this chapter.
So much more to say. I think I just ought to quit.
Just lowercase q quit for now, not, yes, okay. Just want to have that.
Topic, right.
Very good. All right, well, thank you again for that presentation and for marshaling the group. Why don't we turn now to Shane to talk about the Economic Impacts Working Group.
I'm going to do it from up here, just part because I... Yeah, there's a mic right here, so this should work all right. More or less want to... I'm almost going to read verbatim from the slides. The subcommittee has had a very respectful, thoughtful, vigorous conversation over the last several months, and this is a report on that conversation. Parts of that conversation. I think I chose the label progress report to indicate that it's not done, but on the other hand, there also has been movement that is positive. So we're going to discuss data caps, and there are two parts. One, we're going to define some terms, and then get into some questions. So let's define terms. The topic covered by these slides is the question, what is the source of concern with data caps and wireline non-specialized services? Why did that become the focus? First, there have been questions raised about caps as well as tiers in many public forums and working papers. We viewed our job here as to consider all claims on all sides, and that we could serve a useful function by framing the issues and defining terms and organizing those claims and counterclaims. I have to say these slides start where it's perceived to be the least complex set of issues, that is focusing on caps and not tiers. And that turns out to be quite complex enough to fill up a whole slide deck. Let me say from the beginning, this is not comprehensive. It's just one part of a larger topic. All right, so let's start with the order. The order said about usage-based pricing. This is paragraph 72. Some commentators suggest that the open internet protections would prohibit broadband providers from offering their subscribers different tiers of service or from charging their subscribers based on bandwidth consumed. We are, of course, always concerned about anti-consumer or anti-competitive practices, and we remain so here. However, prohibiting tiered or usage-based pricing and requiring all subscribers to pay the same amount for broadband service, regardless of the performance or usage of the service, would force lighter end users of the network to subsidize heavier end users. It would also foreclose practices that may appropriately align incentives to encourage efficient use of networks. The framework we adopt today does not prevent broadband providers from asking subscribers to use the network less to pay less, and subscribers to use the network more to pay more. Then it left open questions about experiments in business models and pricing, and a charitable reading of the order is that it recognizes there had been quite a lot of evolution in the internet and in business pricing prior to the writing the order, and the order is expecting that would continue and in unexpected ways, and particularly in pricing. And so data caps are not mentioned specifically, but it's in that spirit that we are looking at this experiment. So why focus on data caps in the wireline and non-specialized area? First of all, it's because the order distinguishes between these. And there are various reasons for this, as in some sense we've already gone over them today, and having to do with capacity and management and technical issues and differences between the wireline and wireless space. In addition, if you read the order, it's in the footnotes. There's lots of footnotes to the National Broadband Plan and other material. In addition, specialized services, as we were just talking, is different and raises another set of questions, particularly concerns about discriminatory practices, as we just discussed, and that's distinct from some of the issues we're going to talk about just now. So it's in some sense to try to organize the conversation. And due to that specialization, we focused in on this topic in particular, and in addition, let's recognize time constraints play a role. We're only going to do so much. Okay, so let's define terms. Part one, usage-based pricing takes many forms. It's on a continuum from metering to discrete steps and price levels. Volume-based pricing can discount or increase with volume. It can be based on a number of things, including time and volume of data. It has appeared in many settings, and we want to be careful not to use a single characterization for usage-based pricing, including things such as metered pricing in electricity, tiered pricing in cellular telephony. These are very common applications, and there are many more. We're going to use the phrase data caps. It's difficult to get a precise definition. It's a colloquial term that's used quite frequently in the news. It is a form of usage-based pricing. It's a very special case. We're going to focus on a very special case just to focus the conversation. That is a case where you have just a cap. We want to be clear there are other issues in usage-based pricing we're not dealing with, and we leave open many topics. Part 2, data caps are characterized by a price for the data usage within the cap, and then that is below a threshold. The threshold defines a limit on the amount of data per month per household, and after exceeding the threshold, a household faces a different term of service, such as a change in charge, termination, or throttling. A typical case in wireline broadband is a monthly cap on total monthly usage of data, and that's where we will focus our discussion. I'll show you some evidence in a moment. These slides do not focus, and let's be clear, on some other cases. So we do not focus on all general effects of tiered pricing, though some of the concerns will overlap. A related case that we do not focus on is pricing tiers within a cap, though, again, some of the concerns will overlap. And then we do not focus on the case, we will focus on the case of a single cap for all traffic, and consequently will not focus on a case of a cap to some class of traffic and not to others, which is in some sense what was just coming up. Okay, so why does this concern arise? Principally because the concern is about caps arising in less competitive settings. Why does that arise? Generally because users have no or fewer substitutes. This is, again, there's quite a lot of variance, so we should say there's a perception that there is a limited competition in some areas, and that this gives the supplier the ability to make a take or leave it offer to the user, and the user then has no other alternative. And again, we want to emphasize the precaution about making sweeping generality here. There's quite a lot of variance across vendors and geographies and access modes. Second, there is a perception of limited discipline on suppliers in an environment of limited competition. There's less need for the supplier to be transparent and visible. Again, we've emphasized this today. And there's less incentive, or there is an incentive to shape the menu of choices and steer user understanding. And then the concern again arises that there's an opportunity to use the pricing model to protect present services from future competition. So the concern about caps tends to focus specifically at the high end. Again, that's in quotes. We actually are debated the definition of high end and did not reach resolution, but there is this perception that something like a low end, there are quite a wide variety of options, especially in the dense locations of the United States. Whereas at the high end there are less options, and that is an open question. The size and definition of high is also a moving target that tends to change over time, and experts disagree on the likely rate at which it will change, especially as cloud-based services and video services deploy. A common prediction is 20% a year growth at households, but exactly what that means and what the variance will be, we also debated quite a bit. Why do we not have a definitive conclusion? I'll just say it very simply, because there's no definitive data. We ourselves were assessing multiple sources of data. Among them were the Sandvine Global Broadband Report, the Cisco Visual Network Index, SAM-NOS, and the FCC Measuring Broadband Report. Okay, just to give you an illustration, usage varies depending on the ISP and technology, but all the measurements we saw showed a great skew in usage. That's something we're going to talk about, and suggest that caps do not yet impact users other than the highest users. Again, we'll show you some evidence of that in a moment, but this is a picture that gives you some idea. This is from the FCC's Measuring Broadband report. We should just note a point of caution that the granularity of the slide declines as you get into the higher end, and so that's a footnote from the actual report. But it demonstrates, as I said, differences across mode and usage. Now, we also got a question, just what are the facts about caps, and what do they look like today? So first of all, I'd like to do a shout out to GigaOM for doing a little bit of work on it. I'm going to go to the next slide and then come back. The next slide is just an excerpt from their article from October this fall, showing what caps look like at many providers in the United States. And just, again, warning about don't take this at face value. There are many qualifying exceptions, and the article is quite clear about. But this is just to give you a range of what you see. First of all, what you see is some providers don't do any caps, and some providers do. And the second thing you see is that in many of the cases where the caps are applied, they're quite high. Okay, so then a second question that naturally arises once you see those numbers is what's the relevant benchmark for understanding a cap? And actually, it's actually quite hard to pin down, but here are a couple things that help. Household usage per month varies. Approximately today, it looks something like a median of 14 gigabytes per month with an average that's much higher. That's due to the skew, and that's due to a very recent report from Bauer, Clark, and Lair. Who's this guy, Clark? In addition, here's from a report last year from Cisco. Places the number at slightly higher level with an average of 26 gigabytes. That's average is lower, but then the forecast would project something much higher, 84 gigabytes in the next several years by 2016. However, when you look at those, what you come to the tentative conclusion that the most wireline caps today affect only extreme high users, much less than 1% of the households are covered by a 150 to 300 gigabyte cap. Another benchmark you might use relative to that is the hypothetical cord cutter with 5 hours of TV viewing per day. The math of that works out to approximately 300 gigabytes per month. Of course, that's quite speculative, and again, we want to recognize that's not that's just, there's a lot of variance that's possible given DVR use and type of viewing and so on. Nonetheless, you then might ask in response, can a cap be binding on an extreme user? And the answer to that is also yes. We have an example of that from our good neighbors to the north. Canada has experienced caps at the levels of 60, 40, and 25, and because it was poorly measured and not transparent to users, it did have an effect on household demand for third-party internet services such as Netflix. Okay, so that's defining terms, and now we're going to questions. So we tried to, we had quite a vigorous discussion, and this is an attempt to organize some of the concerns that were raised into 4 categories. So first set category is questions about user knowledge and understanding. From a consumer standpoint, caps are generally more appealing when they're predictable and their properties are knowable, and that motivates the question, what do users know and understand? Why would you be concerned about this? Because most household surveys find rather poor knowledge of speed and usage of their own broadband and applications, and cite the Pew surveys, which have been finding that misunderstanding for years. A related concern is that there are changing norms for software usage and more innovation, and so users have limited ability to understand a bit rate of an application. And another related concern is the tools for measuring data use are also changing. There are some tools beginning to emerge. The question emerges then, how widely are they used, and can we use them to measure one's own application, and if so, how to encourage that use. And there is the counter example of what's happening in wireless, where there are tools as well, and users have been adjusting over time. A related concern is user notions of fairness. There's the typical user pays the same as a heavy user, and then again, that becomes a moving target. Will cap be updated to account for changing user behavior and changing costs? And so we reached the tentative conclusion, important consumer education. There's an important consumer education component to this topic, no matter how we get at it. And then that reaches the sub-question, which is that transitory or permanent? And whose responsibility would it be? Another concern that arose in our discussions has to do with the role that caps play. I'm going to divide that conversation into 2 slides. First is a short run and a long run. We'll do the long run first. If measurement and transparency issues were satisfactorily addressed, could a monthly cap at a high end, again, and only a cap, reduce data use? And this is necessarily a speculative question, but the experiment is that it would incentivize those near the cap to behave differently, and the household could build a more efficient usage into their own network. And again, those are the people who are doing quite a lot of downloading. In what ways would that be possible? From today's use, you can see things like uncompressed high-definition cameras streaming the internet 24/7 on demand when something else would do. A peer-to-peer server, especially for BitTorrent, that's open all day long, could be have partial operations, and that will do the trick as well for a user. Running servers out of the house on a household contract when they're actually running a business that whose needs are actually quite substantial is another example. So again, a tentative conclusion emerges. Do caps help manage capacity? And we ask the question, yes, no, maybe. And then over the long run, one answer for yes would be if users respond with less overall data usage, then the carrier makes a less costly operation and investment. And then that raises the sub-question, how do long-run costs vary with use and usage change of this sort? And then another sub-question, since usage has historically grown year after year, do we see any evidence that carrier provisions have been different as a consequence? And so far, the committee just said we just couldn't have any evidence to accept or refute any proposition about how caps affect usage.
And I just want to say there's 5 minutes left in your block.
Oh, okay.
Fascinating, but if there's a way to...
All right. Well, all right, then we'll do this one. This slide is really simple. This is a role in managing peak times, and I think the answer is caps are generally not there to reduce congestion at peak, and that was a pretty straightforward conclusion. They're not adopted for that reason, and so generally have not had that effect. And then, there's a question about whether control over data contributes to exceeding caps, and again, I think the answer here is, in principle, these concerns could matter, but at the moment, we're not sure they're the most salient ones, and we would like the committee to consider whether they're salient today. Let me end with this one, because this one, we had quite a vigorous discussion on in the committee. Do caps have an impact on edge providers? There are two ways to look at it, and I think the two examples at the top of the slides gets the point across. On the one hand, caps in Canada did cause Netflix to set a low quality bitrate limit as a default for users, and that to remove the fears. And so as a result, the high definition content on all ISPs is not present in Canada, and that reduced the user experience. On the other hand, there's been a bettering of codecs to higher resolution using fewer resources with more efficiency, and that's been happening regardless of caps, and that's been going on. And those two examples sort of give you the two sides that we went back and forth on, and so we wanted to raise that question about how to think about this going forward. And so let me finish off by saying we were trying to define the space of the issues about caps and what they mean, and frame the definitions and identify the concerns and questions. And as I said, there are questions about user understanding, about how they manage capacity, about control over data, and about the behavior of other providers in the internet, and whose responsibility for such concerns those should be. And this is work in progress. And so, yeah, thank you.
All right, once more, much food for thought. Questions or comments from members of the working group or the committee? Yep, Chip?
Yeah, I just want to, in terms of carrying on discussion of this issue, in terms of second order and third order effects of caps, and also some things we were discussing last night in terms of as the information becomes more easily understandable from consumers and available to consumers, what effect that has on consumer behavior of caps. And we've talked about, for example, if I'm paying $50 a month for 300 gigabytes, and I understand exactly where I'm at the end of the month, and I see that I've only used 100 gigabytes, then I might be incented to use the rest of my cap. So do caps also perhaps incentivize more use of the network as opposed to less use of the network? More use of the network by lower users as opposed to less use of the networks from the high-end users. So that's just one thought I had.
Boy, that could be the worst of all worlds. Yeah.
Especially if the billing cycle is at the end of the month for everybody. The other one is that the graph you showed would be interesting to watch that over time, because being old enough to remember, the left end of that graph was not even available as a service 10 or 15 years ago. So being able to have the innovation in the networks to provide that extra bandwidth in order to even have a cap is also an important thing that we need to consider. But thank you, I appreciate it. Good thought. Yeah.
Other thoughts? Yep, Chuck?
It's a rich area, and I think you guys have done a great job in kind of framing up some of the important issues. This is one of these situations where all four of the groups have some substantive work going on, and unfortunately I didn't have time to contribute too much to what was going on in this group. I do think, I'll just make a couple points, because, usage-based pricing and pricing in general is, again, an area that's a pretty rich area. One thing I don't think really came across in the report that probably is important to note, there really are some fairly fundamental rationale at work in any form of usage-based pricing. Caps, as you term them, is one form of usage-based pricing. Metering would be another, and so on. But essentially, one of the rationales is that it shifts more cost onto heavier users, as opposed to what essentially exists with a flat rate pricing mechanism, where essentially light users essentially are charged a higher amount in order to which has the effect of subsidizing heavier users. So that shifting of the cost onto the cost causers is kind of one of the fundamental rationales. As you said, it provides an incentive to users to manage their capacity. There's a story that economists talk about how New York City didn't have water meters for many, many years. And as a result, there was no incentive for people to fix leaky pipes. So you put in place water meters, and there is an incentive to fix leaky pipes, which is both an incentive for the consumer as well as for the application provider. The other thing, which is, I think, very, very important and isn't really coming across, there was a lot of discussion about the fact that the marginal cost of an additional gigabyte of capacity on a broadband network is approximately zero. The issue that's not coming across is that these networks are essentially very high fixed costs, have very high fixed costs associated with them. So the essentially usage-based pricing in whatever form also has the effect of essentially allowing the provider to cover their high fixed costs and to provide the revenue to fund future investment. If presuming that the internet traffic growth continues to on the trajectory that it's on, these networks are not static. Every year there are billions of dollars being invested to essentially support the demand. And the usage-based pricing provides an equitable way of essentially providing the revenue to fund that additional investment. And I think if you look historically over time, the cost per gigabyte or megabyte of data transmitted to consumers has been dropping. So there's not an indication that the effect of is driving greater cost to users. Consumers are benefiting from the investment that the providers are making. The one final point about sort of flat rate pricing versus a pricing structure which places a greater percentage of the cost on heavier users is that there's certainly a historical concern of the Commission has not been just sort of the economic efficiency arguments, but also arguments related to fairness. And tiered pricing structures do actually provide a lower price entry point for lighter users. And given the concerns in the National Broadband Plan about adoption, having a pricing structure which allows users that are consumers that can't afford a higher price service to purchase a service at a lower price actually benefits adoption, which is one of the issues that I think the Commission is concerned about. So I think we also have to look at, there are many factors with pricing, but I think the fairness issue is one that also needs to be addressed.
Thanks. Given the shortness of time, I wonder, Shane, if we should just put it back to you either to respond. I know that there's actually been a lot of discussion on exactly these issues from Chuck, and also possibly to share what you figure next steps are for the group. Do you kind of know where you want to go next to start addressing the many good questions that you raised in the deck?
Yeah, that is. There is an open question about where to go next. That actually came up has come up in our online conversation. I don't know how concrete you want me to be with some of the options. Just say obviously we left out a more general discussion of usage-based pricing. We left out very serious discussion of discriminatory practices, or potential for discriminatory practices. We're using a cap on some traffic and not others. We left out a number of issues like that we just hadn't, and wireless, we just hadn't talked about.
I guess one question would be whether the place you've gone on caps that has mapped out the different contingencies and what would follow if X were true, we just don't know how true X is because of an absence of data, or it's very premature here, that kind of thing. Does that mean basically a bookmark goes in there, or do you anticipate an ability to answer enough of the questions to then get to a place where there might be recommendations or thoughts?
I wouldn't mind asking the committee that. There was an attempt to use today's presentation as a forcing function to see if we could come to a consensus about definitions, which we were close to. But I wouldn't want to speak for somebody else, the committee, about whether we've reached a consensus. There were we're still getting emails from people worried about some uses of terms. So I think we're still debating that quite a bit.
Any final thoughts on this or any other aspect of?
To try and connect this to some of the other earlier discussions, would it make sense to look at what incents ISPs to build infrastructure, and rather than looking at what they have done in the past to manage the build of that infrastructure, meaning tying usage to price or usage-based pricing, it would be interesting to me, and it would touch on specialized services. It would touch on some of the things we wrestle with, even the mobile broadband. Having some view of what historically incents them, and some conjecture on that, so we could look forward and say, well, what will incent them going forward to build more infrastructure that would lead to more internet, but also capacity for specialized services and the interplay of those? I think that's the interesting question to me, and I don't know if that's one you've thought about addressing next.
I had one quick comment on it. One thing I didn't see mentioned in there was anything about fixed wireless. There was a talk of wireless, and one thing I think it's important to make sure is a clarification. Fixed wireless is much more approaches a wireline model than mobile wireless does. And just to provide a little bit of anecdotal from an operator point of view, we ran usage-based billing for about a 2-year period, and we discontinued it about 6 months ago after we had finished upgrading the majority of our network to be able to handle more capacity. And I think that would be a preferred model to try and get to, is to where operators get their network upgraded to the point where data caps are not necessary as much anymore.
So maybe I should say thank you to Shane for pulling this together and for shepherding the work of this group. Looking forward to the next steps that lie ahead on this complicated topic, and open it up now to public comment. There are microphones flanking the room, and I see a line already there. So feel free to identify yourself if you like and ask a question, make a comment.
Hi, my name's Chris Whitteman, and I'll be quick because I want to hear what Barbara has to say. I come at this from a slightly different perspective. I'm a staff attorney at the California Public Utilities Commission, and I'm not here today on their behalf, but on behalf of the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates, also known as NASUCA, commented extensively in the open internet proceeding. And I bring to this my experience at the Public Utilities Commission as a staff attorney in the telco area, AT&T T-Mobile merger as one place. where we saw some of these issues raise their heads. I see what you're doing. You're very closely focused on technical issues, and I fear that, and I see the utility of that and the necessity of that, but I fear that you're losing perhaps perspective on some of the overriding constitutional, antitrust, consumer protection principles that might inform your work. One example where I see the tight focus causing some problems is this, the acceptance of carriers, app developers, and equipment providers as the natural universe where you're operating without trying to deconstruct the economic relationships between those three parties. I know in the AT&T T-Mobile merger, we talked a lot about the monopsony power of the carriers vis-a-vis the handset providers. So that's a question that arises in my mind. How entirely separate are those parties, or maybe they are, as you said, Jonathan, second and a half parties? I'm also thinking of the symbiotic relationship between the cable companies and Scientific Atlanta back in the day when I did cable access work. This tight focus also comes into view with the comment that this is all changing. I think the gentleman at the end of the table said that. Yes, that may be true, but I've been doing PUC telco work for 12 years, and before that another 15 years of consumer protection, and I've heard a lot of these tropes before. It's so complex, the user is buying a value package, and in almost every instance, those tropes, those phrases are used to push back against disclosure, clear attempts to remedy the information asymmetry between users and network providers. So just to leave you with a couple questions, in the triad in the mobile broadband report, I'm wondering who is the proxy or the best proxy for consumers? Is it the app developers? That's the way it seemed to me reading through it. And then the other question I had is in your working groups, are you distinguishing between ISPs, the broad category, and carriers, the much narrower category? Those, admittedly, many carriers are ISPs, but I think a carrier such as AT&T is a very different breed of ISP than, say, DSL Extreme. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I don't know if anybody wants to respond in any way or speak to
it. Just quickly answer one question on the question of whether or not the hardware manufacturers are actually independent of the carriers. One of the things we discovered when we looked at the FaceTime use case was that the carrier didn't block, the handset manufacturer blocked, and so we did ask ourselves the question of, did they do that? Would they have done that had the carrier not had a lot of influence in the choices that the handset manufacturer was making? And we didn't come to a conclusion on that, but we certainly asked the question.
Yeah, I'll say something. I mean, we are beginning to look, to your point about the larger ecosystem of devices, device OS vendors, network equipment providers, application developers, and look at the interplay of those parties and see who actually has the power in that. And I think that's one of the things you're raising. I think that's very good. As for who represented consumers, I think we all played the consumer role because we all looked at it as what would we have liked to have seen based on the facts that we saw. But yes, you're right. I mean, Brad and Alyssa played a little bit of a role of here's what an application developer would like to see. But fundamentally, we are all consumers of these services, and I think we all tried to look at it as what would we have liked to have seen here that also seems reasonable. So I don't think we detached ourselves and say we're not consumers of these services, because that would actually, I think, eliminate some of the value we provide.
Professor, were you wanting to say something, Chuck?
Depends how much time we have.
Professor Van Schevick.
Okay, so my name is Barbara Fenschewig. I'm a law professor at Stanford Law School. I'm a computer scientist, and I've done a lot of work on network neutrality. And as many of you know, I was heavily involved in the evolution of the open internet rules, and the order relies heavily on my work. And so I thought some of the questions that came up might actually be answered by me, and so that's what I wanted to focus on. And I hope that will help give some perspective on the questions you asked. So the two areas I wanted to talk about was the mobile group and the specialized service. So first, I thought you did a great job teasing out all the conflicting incentives, and I think that's really helpful and adds to the public discussion. So I want to tell you briefly about how I think the order would solve that problem, and I think that's helpful because it might actually solve some of the issues that you were struggling with. The question of how can you incentivize application developers to develop an app that's more efficient or that adjusts dynamically to bandwidth constraints. And I think the mechanism that the order envisions for that actually does that. So, I'll leave out whether this is blocking or not, and we could have a long discussion about that. I think the piece that answers your question, and the reason this might be questionable, is it on the handset or in the network? Is this competing with another application? So that these are different issues. But let's assume for a moment this rule applies, and so the Open Internet Order would say this is blocking. Then the next question would be, is this reasonable network management? Because as we heard, there are a lot of concerns about network management that are coming up here. And for these types of concerns, the order has a very clear decision-making framework. It asks first, is there a reasonable network management purpose? And managing congestion is that. And then it asks, is this tailored to that purpose? And we have certain criteria that we use to evaluate the measure. So tailored includes that we react to actual congestion, not potential congestion. That's relevant here because a lot of the concerns that we have actually heard were, we were concerned this might overwhelm the network. And as we know from the Comcast proceeding, where this came up, it's not a tailored approach to congestion to adopt measures like preventing users from using the application in areas of the country or during times where there is no congestion. So this sort of measure would not meet the tailored criterion. And so you would have to come up with something that only happens during times of congestion. Then the second question is, well, what would you do? Then you could ask, well, could I then say, well, if there is congestion, the people on unlimited plans can't use FaceTime. And so the criteria that the order establishes is the congestion management measure controlled by the user, and is it application agnostic? So banning one specific application, FaceTime, is not application agnostic. So in the first place, you would look to something else. And the general mechanism the order envisions by saying, should it be application agnostic, is that, we know if there is congestion, not everybody can get all the bandwidth they want. So there is a very clear understanding there that what the network provider needs to do is allocate bandwidth among users. And the sort of balance that the order comes up with is the network provider allocates bandwidth among users using criteria that are not tied to the application, that are application agnostic, and they could be very different, depending on how much you have paid, how much you have used the internet over a certain period of time. That's the Comcast approach. How much you have contributed to congestion over a certain period of time, if we could measure that. So let's imagine how that would work in practice. So congestion appears. There is someone with Skype, someone with FaceTime, and then other people. You, as the provider, wouldn't be looking at what these people want to do. You would look at, how much do they want to use, and then allocate the bandwidth among them using some criteria that are fair and application agnostic. Once you did that, you might see that the available bandwidth for everybody is sufficient for the people who use the Skype video, but not for the Apple FaceTime, because Apple doesn't adjust as well and uses more bandwidth. So people will find out over time that in congestion, Skype works a lot better than Apple. And that will create a very strong incentive to Apple to adjust its behavior. At the same time, if Apple doesn't adjust its behavior, it won't harm your network because you have this very clear boundary of what every specific user can use. And so you might now say, well, right now our system is not designed to do this type of thing. And to that, the order would probably say, well, in reasonable network management, we say this is the default. We want you to manage the network in an application agnostic way. If you can't do it right now, that's what the FCC said to Comcast. We give you some time to adjust, and we understand that it may take a certain period of time. But if this is feasible, you need to move to that space. And there might be a transition period where we allow more application-specific measures, but that can't be the end game. And I think that's really important for you guys because this type of system might create incentives for the application provider to work with you voluntarily, but it doesn't require you to police applications. It doesn't require applications to ask for permission. And still, at the time of congestion, it's still the user who gets to decide what to do with the available bandwidth, instead of you making a value judgment and saying, because we are concerned about congestion, we just determine that a certain group of people can never use FaceTime, regardless of whether there is congestion or not. And I'll leave it at this, but I would encourage you to look at that more in terms of figuring out whether that might actually solve some of the problems you were concerned about. The second area I wanted to talk about...
I wonder if we shouldn't take it one question at a time. So I don't know if there are reactions on this much. I'm kind of looking at Jen as the head of the working group. I have one thought I could either share now or wait for... and that is, I think the working group made a bit of a decision not to race to the order so much and to the text of the order and such, in part because it's not an adjudicatory function, so it wasn't looking to see was this a violation or not. And also because, at least as my understanding is, but again, we didn't have to compare notes on our understandings of the order, the mobile is treated differently from fixed. If our friends at Comcast were to block FaceTime...
But the reasonable network management, so the difference is, one, the blocking rule is different, and then it says, in applying the reasonable network management exception, we will, of course, take account of differences in network technology.
I think there's even more than that, it turns out. And this is as good a moment as any to work it through, because I'd love to be corrected if I'm wrong. I think the relevant part is it says, a person engaged in the provision of mobile broadband internet access service, ... shall not block consumers from accessing lawful websites, subject to reasonable network management, nor shall such person block applications that compete with the provider's voice or video telephony services, subject to reasonable network management. So if it doesn't happen to compete, it could do a block even in the absence of an explanation that's reasonable network.
Absolutely, we totally agree, but that was the whole point of my initial thing of saying, for what I'm saying now, I'm assuming that we meet the compete and, we have sort of assumed that blocking rule applies. If that's not the case, you're totally right. They can do whatever they want.
But again, I should, so this is a very helpful colloquy, but again, my understanding of the working group was that it exactly, for better or worse, had not gotten into figuring out the application of the rule were the FCC to receive a complaint and act upon it. But that's also why I think a lot of the discussion was around reasonable network management practices and is this within what one would expect and such. But Jen, I should turn it over to you.
Yeah, I completely agree, and thank you for your comments. They're great. I think there are 2 points. One is what reasonable network management practice is changing over time, and it's something I think you acknowledged as well. And then we spent a lot of time in our group talking about what could have been done using today's technology and finding that there were some constraints on what could be done and what would be an ideal thing to have moving forward, some of which were things that might not be able to happen overnight. And so I think we all acknowledge that that's sort of a moving target. I think that one of the first things you said is something we didn't consider, and I think it's something we should have in hindsight, which is the distinction between actual congestion and anticipated congestion. And I think that's a nice framing that we didn't consider, and I think it's an important one because you're totally right. What happened here was anticipation of congestion rather than actual, and it might very well be that that would change the way people view what's considered a reasonable practice or not.
And I just want to add one thing which might lend some broader perspective to this. So the FCC's Open Internet Order now says, we expect you to manage congestion in application-agnostic ways. Canada says, we expect you to manage congestion in application-agnostic ways. And the group of European regulators just adopted this report of on network neutrality and quality of service. And as part of that, they say, we expect you to manage your networks in application-agnostic ways. And so it seems to me that there is a very clear architectural vision involved that might require work in the technical fora, in the same way that, when the FCC said to Comcast, you need to manage in an application-agnostic way, that triggered a lot of development in new products. And so, maybe just in terms of thinking what kind of initiatives might be required in the industry to move towards that way might be something that you could do, especially in terms of, when David raised this question, how can we help the ecosystem be more successful? Or, if you see there are very clear limits in today's technology that make this very difficult, you might be able to pinpoint and say, so this is something that we should work on over time.
Yes. Now, you said you had a second question, so we should move to that, and that might round out our public comments.
Yeah, so this is on the topic of specialized services, and I wanted to give you just one tiny additional piece of background, which is you are totally right that the only point in defining or not defining specialized service in the context of the order is to define the scope of when the open internet rules apply. Because there was a lot of concern, if we do something else, would the open internet rules apply, and would that be very difficult? And so that's totally right mentioning that. And then you have this definition of what's an open internet access service to which the open internet rules apply, and I would add a third criterion to this slide, which is even if it's not a general service, or even if it doesn't get to all endpoints, it's still subject to the open internet rules if it evades the open internet order. And if it evades, it's this evasion rule in the definition of open internet access service. And that is actually really critical, because things that may not look like a general purpose internet service may, through this evasion rule, come under the scope of the order. And I'll use the Eve example to illustrate that.
What?
The Eve example, the one with the computer game that you used.
Oh, Eve. Sorry, the acoustics are terrible. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It's not your fault.
So one thing we need to answer first to do that was the question answered by Chuck. What do the open internet rules say about quality of service? And if you are interested in learning more about that, I wrote a paper that explains exactly what we can learn from the open internet order. And one thing we know very certain is that there is one form of quality of service that's allowed under the open internet rules, and that's explicitly mentioned, which is the network providers just offer different forms of quality of service, like a low delay service or a low latency service. And then they just make it available, and users choose when and whether they want to use it. So that's clearly in scope. What seems to be relatively clearly out of scope is the network provider making quality of service available only to specific applications, or the network provider making quality of service available to an application and then requiring the application provider to pay for it. The order envisions that the users will pay for quality of service, not the application provider. And this payment question is, they say it's very unlikely to be reasonable under the order if you charge the provider. So I'm describing this because it means your example of Eve is something that would not be possible under the open internet order, but it would be possible for the network provider to offer a low delay service that users of gaming then could use. That's important for the evasion question, because in a way you might now say it's actually possible to serve the needs of the users and Eve within the scope of the open internet order by making available a low delay service that users can use. By now offering that same service in a way that would violate the Open Internet Service as a special service, you will probably be evading the Open Internet Service. You know, so the idea here is that, let's just say for a moment, well, if we are banning things in the Open Internet Order, the whole point is that we don't want them to happen. So if then people could go and do the exact same thing under specialized services, that would sort of make the whole open internet rules unnecessary, because every time you wanted to violate the rules, you would just move whatever you wanted to do to specialized service and offer it, call it a specialized service, and the open internet rules wouldn't apply. And so at least one way of thinking about it is that the evasion language is intended to cover these types of cases. And, you know, so then you might wonder, well, when would we ever have a specialized service? Well, it would be if you would need a specialized service if there was something you wanted to do that you cannot do under the open internet rules, but that should be done. And that's how this specialized service category originally emerged. The history is that the original proposed rule said no discrimination at all on the open internet. That would have made any form of quality of service impossible. Then Janikowski said, well, sometimes we may need quality of service. Let's say the heart monitoring examples is the one people always use. You know, you didn't want the heart attack to be undetected because your packet got dropped right when you had the heart attack. So Janikowski said, or the FCC said, so we allow you to offer that as a specialized service if it's really needed, because it wouldn't be possible to do this on the open internet. But under the new order, the range of things that you can do under the open internet order has increased significantly. And so that leaves less scope for things that reasonably need to be a specialized service.
Barbara, thank you very much for your comments and for your presence. We are well over time. I saw David taking copious notes. I don't know if there's anything you want to say, David, before we wrap.
Well, I just very quickly, I don't think, and you and I can argue about this, I don't think it's useful for us to, as a committee, to be spending a lot of time talking about exactly what the report and order does or does not admit, because there are a lot of advocates for different positions who are going to pay lots of lawyers to do this. I think it would be better for us to back up a step and say, in the long run, what is it that we think the FCC should be saying such that the interests of the various parties are balanced? And I mean, I have read your paper. I know what you're saying. And I would rather not, as I said, go into Talmudic mode and go read paragraph 72, which of course cites you, but rather to back up and say, what is the right balance of interests? And you know, if you want to say that where the chairman started out was a better place than where we ended up, that's a useful piece of input to the discussion. But that's the direction I'd probably take the group.
Regularly, we actually asked the FCC when Daniel Kirshen was on, should we imagine a different set of possibilities? And he encouraged us to think broadly, as you were saying, rather than try and interpret the order. In fact, whenever we would ask, is this consistent with the order, he would sort of say, don't worry about that part. Think about the realm of possibility, given that we're in a rich, evolving landscape. Can you come up with some suggestions that you think have the FCC should consider? So that's really, I think, Jen, is that fair to say? So it was really that we were encouraged to think more broadly rather than to say, would this work within the order? So.
Yeah, and I mean, in fairness, I think that's absolutely the right approach for you to take. And still, I do think that this is why I brought this up. I think the Eve example totally illustrates the type of problem that you need to solve about the scope of the open internet order. And I was sort of framing it as, you know, that's how it would play out in the context of the open internet order. But the underlying problem is, of course, a very salient one. If we ban all sorts of stuff in the open internet and then say, well, but if you really want to do it, you can just do it as a specialized service. Then you have created a real problem for the value or effectiveness of your regulatory framework. And so no matter whether you tie this to, well, the order actually has sort of something in there that is intended to prevent this from happening, or whether you frame this as, this is a problem that is very characteristic for this line between open internet service and specialized services and will influence how we make this distinction, and that we need to think about when we when we think about the problems that might occur.
Yes. Thank you again, Barbara. Thank you, Stanford Law School, for hosting us today. And thanks to the members of the committee for the work from last meeting to this meeting, especially the working group chairs who really helped pull everything together. These in-person meetings are such a great moment to kind of make sure a quantum of work gets done. And speaking of which, our next one will be in Chicago, Illinois. Thank you, Shane, for agreeing to host us there on May the 7th. So mark your calendars now. And with that said, if there's no other business, we stand adjourned. Thanks again.
Are you from